Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope everybody had a nice relaxing lunch. We have an afternoon ahead of us. I want to thank everybody for their patience so far. Madam Clerk.
Item 20 is from the Administrative Office to conduct the fiscal year 2017-18 recommended budget hearings. Items not heard on Tuesday, June 13th will be continued Wednesday through Friday, June 14th through 16th, 2017 until completed.
Okay. At this time, I think we're going to have CAO Lutz make his presentation.
Yes, thank you, members of the board. It's a pleasure to be here today to present the initial County Administrative Officer recommended fiscal year 2017-18 budget. Through the presentation, first I have Judy Hawkins here with Human Resources and Risk Management to provide clarity on questions that the board might have during the presentation. I think also at some point the auditor will also join us again to provide feedback or questions should the board have them. I recognize, first of all, the extent of the budget document, the budget binder that was submitted. Copies of this are on the website for people to view. I also have copies of this PowerPoint presentation on the website for people to download and view. Certainly a lot of work, effort goes into making sure that we pull things together, but this is a very fluid process. Part of why we do this a couple weeks before the statutory deadline is it lets us lets my staff, lets other departments have an opportunity to get board feedback, let us make changes as needed based on the board's requests. During the presentation, I'll go through, kind of talk broad view, economic trends, some of the budget requests, and then seek board input at the end. What I would say though is if you have a question, add a slide, please feel free for the board members. I'm okay if you want to stop, or if you'd prefer just wait until the end is completely up to the board.
Okay. I would like to remind everybody, board members and our public during public comment periods, speak into the microphone for us. We want to make sure our Nielsen ratings go up for our folks over in the TV's land. Thank you.
So again, an overview. First, I want to talk a little bit about legislative policy overview, what's going on federal, state, and local level. Next, really get into our local economic indicators and some of our revenue statistics. Those are really the foundation for one, how we establish our budget in terms of revenue assumptions. Those, any budget really needs to be taking a strong view at where are we headed, what are the revenue trends looking like, because it really gives us an indication of what type of activities we should be looking at. Are we looking at expansion, contraction, or status quo? Next, I'll go into a overview of the requests for all of the funds within the county, but then also certainly drilling down more specifically on county general funds. We'll talk at the latter half about the budget shortfall, some immediate actions that I'm recommending that the board take, and then also looking at that long-term goal, long-term strategies, where do we need to go from here? And of course, I have a delay in my, oh, there we go. So starting off, legislative policy overview. And wouldn't you know it, of course, my clicker does not want to. There we go. All right. So first of all, starting off, state of California budget. That is always the big unknown for us from the local level, because we are so dependent upon the state government, what the governor and the legislature decides. And often, as is the case of this year, we get more unknowns than we do definitive answers, and so we have to make some assumptions as we build our budget. Going through that list, in-home supportive services, the maintenance of effort was, as we know, in the January budget, the governor proposed basically unwinding the in-home supportive services MOE. This had a potential huge cost shift back to the counties. A number of years ago, they realigned or restructured in-home supportive services to put counties under an MOE with a 3.5% cost inflator. Well, as the numbers would bear out ultimately, that it's not a cost-effective way for the state to manage the program, because as we know, with an aging population and people living longer, the in-home supportive services program is one of the largest growing programs statewide for state entitlement programs. So with that, the governor proposed basically worst case scenario, counties were going to go back to our old share of cost mechanism. There was a lot of discussion with CSAC and California Welfare Directors Association and the governor. A compromise deal was reached, and let me pull up my notes. I apologize, my computer locked. But ultimately, a compromise deal was reached in the short term, and I emphasize that it is really a short-term fix. What the state's proposed is shifting $1.1 billion in state general fund over 4 years to mitigate the cost of unwinding the MOE. They basically did a bailout, so to speak, to help counties. What it'll do in the long term is implement a new MOE at a new base level starting this year, where the costs basically are roughly equivalent to where they were prior year. And then in 2018-19, those costs would increase 5%. And then in 2019-20, those costs would increase 7%. So we're looking at long-term some pretty significant cost increases within the in-home supportive services program locally. It also does a couple of troubling shifts, one of which is redirecting the VLF growth revenues from 1991 health, mental health, and county medical services program, or CMSP, sub-accounts for 3 years. So essentially sweeping some of the growth funds that Health and Human Services relies on to utilize little or no general fund. It also then redirects growth in those accounts in years 4 and 5 at 50%. So this is something that's going to impact us certainly at Health and Human Services for 5 years and into the foreseeable future. There also is a requirement that counties now conduct collective bargaining locally with their IHSS providers. That had been moved to the state, and now it comes back to the counties through the public authority. And we must begin that process within 9 months, starting July 1. After that, they're able to file a complaint with PERB. There is a reopener in this after 3 years. It's convenient. The reopener is after the governor is out of office. And I think ultimately it's, here's a short-term fix, but it's not a long-term fix. And I think the governor recognizes that, but it's going to be the next governor to really have to tackle that. Next is SB1, that's the transportation bill. Another area that we're watching closely because there's a promise of revenue, but still working through the mechanics of what that really looks like. We know that they are estimating that this measure between a VLF increase, so vehicle license fee increase, and also a gas tax increase, one starting in November for the gas tax, the next starting in January. The state is expecting $5.2 billion starting for fiscal year 2018-19. This year, because of it only starting out half year, they only estimate about $2.8 billion. And in order to be eligible for those additional funds, counties must submit project lists basically detailing what they're asking for the funding for. More importantly, there's some concerns that there are requirements in there for base spending, and where they set this MOE base year can be cost prohibitive for some counties. We're in the process of evaluating exactly what that looks like, and Jeff Krovitz might speak to that a little bit when he gets to Public Works, as that's going to be a critical component for their budget request and ultimately what gets into the final budget for September. We also are still facing the Board of Equalization calculation error. That calculation error was in some of the sales and use tax that was distributed out to counties. The state has not given us a real indication of just how much that is. They've given us a range of $100 million to $300 million statewide, and that is to the benefit of the state general fund, i.e. counties would have to pay some funds back. The governor did propose that there's repayment forgiveness granted through fiscal year 15-16. So really we'd be looking at 16-17, 17-18 and forward for a potential reduction. But again, at this point, that's unclear what that amount's going to be, and that's something we're watching closely. We have yet to see significant impacts here locally for the minimum wage law, but in the next couple years, that's going to be something that's going to be a serious issue for us in terms of having to make sure we're, one, bringing some of our positions that will be below the then minimum wage into compliance, but more importantly then, that we're also looking at what the impactions are to classes right next to there and whether we have to also increase those classifications. So that's going to be something that is going to really hit us in the out years as that minimum wage law rolls out over the next 5 years. Unfunded pension liabilities, which I'm going to get into in more depth in a future slide, is another huge issue for us that is at the state level, local level. Tree mortality, as we know, is a significant issue for us locally, as along with many of our mountain community counties and neighbors. The new budget has a reduction of $44.2 million from the January proposal, essentially sweeping almost all of those funds, leaving only $2 million allocated for local agencies. That's a significant concern because our program itself would take up those funds, let alone other counties that have as big of a problem or larger than our own. So there's going to have to be some resolution long-term for that that addresses the needs of counties as they combat this tree mortality crisis. As we all know, not addressing it through proactive measures will ultimately cost us more, as we have increased risk of forest fire, and fighting forest fires is certainly going to be a lot more expensive than addressing the problem head-on with proactive measures. And the state also is still grappling with implementation on Prop 64, what that looks like in terms of the regulation through state agencies, and what, if any, opportunity for local revenues to come to counties to address abatement efforts. That's something that we're, again, looking at closely, but it's still very much in its infancy stages, and it would be difficult to really provide much strong guidance one way or the other on that issue. And there we go. So drilling down a little more deeply on the state unfunded pension liabilities, I put this in here to provide a level of context. It gives you an idea of the scope, really, of how bad the unfunded liabilities are across the state. Looking at the OPEB, which is your other types of benefits, primarily health insurance for a lot of your agencies, that's not typically included in a calculation for unfunded liabilities, but it's also another huge factor, as we're really a pay-as-you-go for our retiree health benefits. You can see, though, state teachers' retirement system, and then public employees retirement fund, and then the counties sitting right in there next to that to see total across the board, counties approaching $30 billion statewide in terms of the unfunded pension liabilities. Locally, our current unfunded pension liability is approximately $40.2 million for our general members and $12.5 million for our safety members. So that is absolutely something that we've been looking at very closely. What really has brought this to more of a head is in December, the CalPERS board came in and looked at their historical rates of return, and they approved lowering their discount rate to reflect the fact that, as you can see from this graph, this represents kind of that 1999-2000 time period where they had fairly consistent, strong growth. Since then, as we know, we had the dot-com bubble that burst, and then the real estate bubble, the Great Recession, and since that period, CalPERS has continually shown significant declines rather than increases on their returns. Reflecting that, the board voted that through fiscal year 2017-18, the discount rate remains at 7.5%. Starting in 2018-19, that reduces to 7.365%. In 2019-20, that goes down to 7.25%, and then down to 2020-2021, where it goes down to 7%. What that means for us locally and translates to is no slide changer. There we go. Which then means essentially that our projected 5-year CalPERS costs continue to go up as that discount rate changes, and the amount that we have to pay per enrollee in the current system, these are current county employees, will increase at an exceptionally high rate. You can see now sitting a little under $6 million, going up now to almost $11 million. That's a significant payroll cost that will be an ongoing payroll cost for us at that point.
I do have a question. With that scale that you show there, and is that geared to reduce those unfunded liability? Is that the goal here?
That's essentially their goal, is to close that gap by now reducing that rate of return, and then you're starting to fill that unfunded liability hole. Counties or municipalities that have more free cash on hand are doing other mechanisms to help pay that down in advance. And ideally, that's what you do to try and smooth that out. Unfortunately, with our cash position, that isn't a feasible option at this point. I mean, we might be able to do it with some small dollars, but nothing large enough to really fill that hole. And I don't know if the auditor has any other comments. I know she's intimately involved in the analysis on this and tracks this pretty closely. I don't know if she wants to add any comments.
Basically, this is just a culmination of CalPERS board changes that have occurred over the last 4 or 5 years, back to when PEPRA was initially adopted. And if you recall, some of you that have been either on the board or paying attention to board meetings, I have reiterated that the bill is coming, the bill is coming, the bill is coming. So one of those where Tim and I have discussed options in terms of smoothing some of this for the county, coming up with some sort of policy direction from the Board of Supervisors to set some monies aside on a annual basis to try to kind of pre-fund some of this, just kind of take some control over this. It's quite possible that we may be able to have a better investment return than what CalPERS has been doing. And so if that's a possibility, then we could take those limited funds that we would have and at least we'd kind of start getting ahead of it. So we're kind of figuring out, you know, where do we come up with money when we don't have it, as opposed to not doing anything and falling off the cliff at the end. So it's definitely something we're discussing and we're watching and we're looking at some options and alternatives. But we just wanted to make sure that you as a board understand the bills are starting to come. And it's really outside of our control in terms of how much we're going to have to pay. But if there are some mechanisms that we can do on the front end that can kind of make it a little bit more tolerable on an annual basis, then we're definitely going to try to get ahead of that.
And I would also say that, you know, looking across many counties right now, this is one of the biggest impacts that almost all the counties up and down the state are facing, you know, whether they're CalPERS or independent funded systems. And it has been coming to a head again based on the reform with pensions, based on the analysis recommendations and requirements coming down from the state. Every county's facing similar issues, which is also why this year has been a particularly bad year, I think, for county departments and budgets across the state, because of anticipating this and how do you set aside this much money so it doesn't really wipe out key services. Did I laze you?
No.
Oh. So going back then at the federal level, there's still questions lingering out there on what's going to happen with Affordable Care Act, and that does have a local impact, particularly on some of our health and human services programs and funding that they receive for expanded services to people that typically would fall outside of the normal Medi-Cal eligibility requirements. That's your single childless adults. There are the impact here because of working with the CMSP, providing health services would be felt through our contract with them. But what it ultimately would do is reduce some of the local funds available to Health and Human Services for operations if there were to be a repeal without a replace option. It's something to look at. Our county, just based on our Medi-Cal statistics, isn't going to be as impacted as some of the other areas throughout the Central Valley, but this is still one of those areas that we look at because it reduces overall funding through our subvented departments. And lastly, local level, just some considerations on the horizon and looking at what are our cost liabilities. We still, we're in the midst of collective bargaining with our unions, and we have been, again, trying to factor in at some point knowing that we're going to need to do something, whether it be 6 months down the road or at an earlier or later time. Ultimately, we know that there's going to have to be some shifts within some of our funded programs or funded departments where we have staff that are that need equity adjustments. It's just keeping that in mind as we go into this budget cycle and knowing what set-asides we might need to think about. And then also the cannabis ban. This budget assumes that we have no additional revenues from the cannabis tax at this point. This assumes that we are still spending down on the urgency ordinance funds that have been collected to continue the abatement efforts and to also continue going through the final enrollment of or permitting or denying of any of the registered applicants. The remaining pieces are at this point assumed kind of out there to be, considered by the board at a later time when the ultimate decision on a ban is decided.
I do have a question. Getting back to the top one of affordable care, is there any other movement going? There was a movement for California to be covered by itself. Is there anything on that you've heard going forward?
Nothing beyond, I think it's been floated out there that, California would come up with a basically a universal health plan program. The issue and what came back was really how are you going to pay for it? And at this point, I haven't seen a complete or legitimate proposal to actually show where those funds would come from outside of large tax increases in certain areas. Certainly, I can pull the most relevant updated information to bring back if you'd like to look at that.
No, I just thought if you had any information on if it's gaining steam. I know I'm not talking. Whether it was gaining steam or not, or is it somewhere down the road, or is it just going to die, or what? If you have any information on that?
It's been surprisingly quiet since it first came out. For something as such a radical change, it really hasn't had a lot of discussion based on that. But again, this is just speculation on seeing how these things play out. It seems like it's going to be one of those things that's going to be pushed to a later legislative session if they're going to take it, knowing some of the other. I think part of it is it was waiting to see what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act repeal. Until they know what's going to happen with that, it's hard to develop a program because you don't know how much money you have that you need to come up with. So I think they're kind of tied in that way.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so then moving on now to really the local level, more specific local level. When you look at what the state's economic forecast says, they're projecting increasing personal and corporate income tax receipts. At the same time, which is interesting, they're also, although I guess, you increase the amount of tax money, then there's less to go in the economy, one would argue, that you see slowing sales tax receipt growth that they're seeing. And they're attributing that with weak business spending, increases in medical costs, and inflationary pressures. In general, they're predicting 4 years of moderate growth. It's interesting because going into end of last year, they were projecting a potential mini little recession and a market reset. I think that might be a overly optimistic view to say that we're going to have 4 years of moderate growth. But I did want to point out it's in contrast to kind of what we're locally seeing right now, or at least what I would be projecting, where they're saying roughly a 3.7% annual average growth is what the state projects for overall the state economy. If you look at our local economy, this first item is the historical assessed property values dating back to 2000, 2001. Easy to spot the housing boom and then the subsequent housing collapse or decrease, so to speak, with the Great Recession. And where you could see that we really started to level off in 2012, 2013, just starting to get some of that recovery in 13, 14, 14, 15, and then we had Butte Fire that hit, which has obviously impacted local property values, overwhelmed our services to be able to make sure that we're getting all of the assessments out there completed in current day. And so we're really seeing a pretty stagnant or very low growth. In conversations with the assessor's office, most recently, again, these are all estimates. For this budget purpose, we were looking at about a 0.68% increase in assessed values. When the roll closes the end of this month, obviously, we'll be looking closely at what that final number looks like, because that does have a huge impact locally, as that's really our largest source of discretionary revenues for the general fund. For comparison purposes, and I put this in here because I think it's important to note that certainly assessed value increases, they're lagging behind neighboring and similar sized counties, which are realizing about a 4% to 5% increase in their assessed rolls. As an indicator of where we might be seeing growth, this is just indicating what our average housing sale prices are for year-over-year changes. It's important to note, of course, these are not going to track exactly with assessments, because this is just in housing sales. It's not going to be necessarily all properties within the county. So while this certainly isn't a dollar-for-dollar track for where our assessed values are, it is an indicator of which direction those real estate values are going, whether they're going up or whether they're going down, which then has that correlational relationship to assessed property values. To also kind of look at what should we be seeing, which direction are we heading, the general strength of the economy. Some of the key things that we also look at is what's going on with our building permits. In this case, looking at residential new structure permits, very clear flat line over the downturn, and we have started to see a decent increase upward. The difficulty is, and there's no real clean way to sort out from the building permits how much could have been attributed to people who needed to rebuild with Butte Fire versus how many were genuine brand new residential structures. Also, an important note would be additions or other permits. And again, your additions are true additions to residential square footage of a property. Maybe you finish a basement, versus your other is going to be your decks, your roofs, your carports, things like that aren't necessarily additional square footage within the house. Again, we could see an uptick in both areas, smaller on residential additions. It's, I think when I looked at it, it was about a 1% increase, versus obviously a lot in the residential other category. Equally important, and certainly for job growth, exceptionally important, the commercial permits. Looking at commercial other, which the commercial other also includes if a business expands the amount of space they're using. So that actually does encompass adding space to an existing facility. And then commercial new buildings are just that, new buildings. And there was actually a decent uptick in 2016 on the new commercial building permits that were requested. When we start to look at some of our key revenue indicators, sales tax receipts, always outside of property taxes, sales tax receipts are another strong area that we look at for discretionary revenues. You can see here, and the blue represents when we were operating under the triple flip. Since the triple flip has now sunset, those bonds have been paid off. Now we're back to receiving the straight sales tax as we should have been. And so you can see now what our estimate is for 2017, that I feel is a pretty conservative estimate based on where we've been tracking. I think that I would expect that to be pretty much a realistic number. It was about 750,000, I think is, yeah. Vehicle license fees, interesting that the trend has been slowing on vehicle license fees, and I felt that we wanted to keep it level for this year as well, particularly because it's still not clear what's going to happen with VLF increases with SB1, and are they going to do something funky with new monies that come in or changing some of those accounts. The conservative approach in this instance was really to budget more or less where we're at now, very, very small growth on VLF. And then transient occupancy tax, you will note although this dollar amount is smaller relative to the other funding sources, that we are showing an increase here. One, we've seen a general increase, in part attributable to all the work crews probably in the area with Butte fire recovery, and now winter storm damage contractors and tree mortality. But I also feel confident with this number given the recent agreement that was signed with the Airbnb. Through that agreement, Airbnb will be collecting transient occupancy tax for all users who are booking rooms through the Airbnb service. That really closes a potential loophole where we had a lot of rental that we just weren't getting the TOT on. Some didn't know they needed to provide it. There was limited enforcement, so that really closes the loophole. So I feel confident that that number is a conservative projection, and that we will at least realize that increase. So next is going to all funds summary. Any questions, comments before I get to that point? I'm going to take a drink of water before I keep going.
You're allowed.
Okay, turn it on. It was my understanding that under Prop 13, there was to be a 2% year over year, correct?
Are you talking about increase in allowable increase? That doesn't mean that it's always going to be, and I'm sure the assessor could, I know she's back there if you want her to answer that question.
It was just a point that if it was 2% was allowable, we're at a 0.68. That's quite a bit of differential there. But when we get to that particular area, we can discuss it. I just wanted to.
Yeah, and I definitely
comments.
would defer to the assessor to answer that question, as she could speak to the nuances on when that 2% is applicable and when it's not.
Would you like to address that? Mr. Okay. All right.
Oh,
We
she's
can do it
coming up
later
now.
time.
Oh, it gives me a break to drink more water.
I'm always thinking of the CAO since he has such an impact on our budget. Yes, the law says, and it's a constitutional provision, that once property has a base year value, it cannot be increased by more than 2% or the change in the California Consumer Price Index, whichever is less. However, too many people assume that all property is assessed under that particular provision, and it's not. Williamson Act properties, for example, are restricted. There is no 2% inflation that is automatically applied to those. There are a number of different types of properties that are not subject to that. The biggest single bulk of those are those properties that are currently in decline in value status, and I would just like to give you a feel for that. We have 45,000 secured parcels in the county. About 1,100 of them are in Williamson Act. About 14,500 are in decline in value status. So they are not subject to that 2%. They're subject to what is happening to the market on January 1st. So trying to use 2% to automatically assume what next year's assessment roll growth will be is really not a good rule of thumb.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Davis.
If there are no other questions, then I'll start on overview of actually the budget request that was submitted. This first is a comparison between 16-17 and 17-18 when you compare the different categories of funds, which would be your general fund, Public Works, Integrated Waste Management Fund, Health and Human Services Fund, your Capital Improvements Fund, Transit, Airport, and your other categories that can include things like public access TV and a few other, smaller funds that roll up into that. Total, we see about a 5% increase in the requested appropriations, and this is a summary of the appropriation request. So it's a roughly 5% increase. For the purposes of the board and the purposes of looking at what has the largest impact locally, we typically look at the general fund piece, and that's where I'll drill down to in a second. But before that, I wanted to kind of give you an overview of when you look at all appropriations across the county, this gives you a percentage breakdown of kind of which category of funds is making up the bulk of your appropriation. Currently, the general fund is about 40%. Health and Human Services, the second largest, at 31%. And then Public Works at 17%. The remaining, again, smaller funded programs that are that make up your residual. So within the general fund budget, what I've tried to do is break down based on our traditional categories with general government, public safety, the development services, which is records and land use, also education, recreation, cultural, miscellaneous, and then also an area that we're capturing some of our declared disasters, because I think it's important to note that as a separate category and call it out. So this right here, and again, this is already summarized within the budget binder, but I broke it down by this category just to kind of show you from the general government categories, which include your administrative office, your assessor, auditor, controller, board of supervisors, communications, community organizations and programs, the county clerk, county council, duplication, elections, facilities, GIS, the grand jury, human resources, IT, mail, postage, recorder, treasurer, tax collector, and utilities. And I was going to say, again, I don't know you're taking pictures. It's on the website. So you can, on the CAO's budget website, you can pull down this entire presentation in case you need copies of something, just in case that doesn't come out. So when we look at it again here, you have your appropriations of roughly $12.7 million that's being requested. Estimated revenues, $5.1 million. Quite a bit of those estimated revenues are going to be A87 costs that are distributed out to using programs, although that's not entirely the case. As I get toward the end of my presentation of my recommendations, you'll note a couple of key areas, primarily your facilities at still utilizing $1.125 million of general fund, where I think there's a better opportunity to look at how we treat the facilities program, potentially also your information technology at 1.1. There are a couple of areas where I think we could do a better job of reflecting where those costs are going, and also creating better accountability and reporting for the board and the public. And I'll, again, get into that when I get to my recommendations piece. The next category, public safety. Public safety obviously includes the Sheriff's Department. These are alphabetical order. That's the only order that I put them in. So that's why they're kind of mixed up from the fund numbers. But obviously that includes Sheriff and a number of the additional ancillary programs that fall under the Sheriff's Office, including jail, marine safety, dispatch, and like the CalNarc Enforcement Unit, those types of programs that all fall under the Sheriff's Department. It also includes the District Attorney, probation, the Coroner's Office, and again, other ancillary programs associated with each of those departments. Total appropriation request, $21.7 million, with roughly $6.5 million in revenue coming in, which then gives you your net general fund of that $15 million, $15.1 million. Development services, records and land use, your ag commissioner, animal services, building, environmental health, on-site wastewater and planning. Again, an area where you, a higher amount of revenue because a number of these programs are able to charge a fee for services within their budget. So their appropriation total, $7.39 million. Revenues 5.7 to have the net general fund request of the 1.68. Education, recreation, and cultural includes adult tutoring, library, and the museum. Their appropriation request roughly $561,000. With estimated revenues $81,000 to come up with general fund request of $480,000. Under miscellaneous, this has a number of as it describes miscellaneous categories. Your non-departmental, which is critical, you'll notice the huge revenue versus the little appropriation on that item. The reason that is that way is that's our primary spot where your property taxes come in, where sales tax comes in, where the bulk of our discretionary general funded revenue comes in. So when you pool all of these, all of the departments together under the 1010 fund, which is your general fund, that's where that large negative, which is a revenue gain of that 22.7 million, then offsets the increases in the other programs, ideally offsets it totally. And then if we have a leftover, which we do, then it has to be taken care of elsewhere. The insurance is where your, again, risk management fund with our all of our different types of insurance that we have to cover, and then revenues that come in for that. I think some of those are going to be distributed through A87 for the associated department costs to basically cover insurance for their areas. General fund contingencies is what we try and budget at a base minimum 2% of your overall appropriations, which is what that $938,000 is. And I'll get into that a little more when we get to the end of this piece. And then county contributions, I wanted to actually break out a little bit, because really what county contributions represents is a lot of our, where we're paying for different programs within the county, or in the case of the Visitors Bureau, a contract for doing basically tourism activities for the county. It also includes the social services MOE that you can see how much we pay for social services MOE, the behavioral health MOE, how much we contribute to the road fund, how much we contribute to public access TV and the community development block grant general fund share. And then the remaining is kind of an ancillary other categories of general like types of programs that we provide funds to, but I felt it important to at least break that out to show you kind of what falls in that, because it's not necessarily descriptive from the name. And then lastly is our disaster. Now, I will note, and some very good news, as working with the auditor's office on looking through budget and looking through what our potential general fund outlays are. When in doubt, I err on the side of the conservative approach to budgeting. On your item right here for your butte tree on private land, my understanding is that we have gotten confirmation that that is a 100% state and federal program, so that actually will provide that savings of $1.3 million. What I wanted to double check before we actually removed that from that list, because that significantly.
Tim, which you're looking at the 920?
I am looking at, 910, the $1.3 million. So that potentially then basically brings your liability here to about $1 million for the declared disasters. I'm reticent to bring it to that level without getting complete confirmation from Public Works on the extent of what we actually expect. Given the sheer number of disasters that we've had, tree mortality and the winter storm damage, I want to make sure we're not estimating low as it appears that I estimated high.
Does that include the road work that will have to happen as we finish this up?
The road work to,
Fire?
yes, that should be included under permanent work. Yeah, that item right there under permanent work.
The top line of 903. What is not included in here would be the Butte fire repair work that's under the ER program. That's the one under the federal aid roads, that FHWA ER program. There's nothing in the budget for that. So that's not included in here.
How much?
You'd have to ask Jeff that.
I'm just trying to.
No, I agree. I think, and this has been the challenge for me on why I didn't want to reduce it and leave it in here so we can have this discussion, because I don't want to paint too rosy of a scenario either.
Jeff Grovitz, the ER portion of the Butte Fire, approximately 40 miles of federal aid eligible roads. Current DAF estimates are in the $8.5 million range for damage recovery, and the match on that is between 2.7 and 3% for local match.
Thank you, sir. Let's.
So what I would say then, bringing it back, when we have the additional discussions, obviously when we get to the final recommended budget on the 27th, I would expect to have a better number from you from Public Works. In the meantime, this gives us a potential for some reduction to the liability that we have. And again, it goes back to my focus on budgeting is, when in doubt, err on the side of caution and assume the worst. And then if the worst doesn't happen, then it provides us opportunities to shore up some of our holes. Ending this out is that total appropriation request for the general funded programs is $64.8 million, with about $57 million in revenue that then leaves a general fund shortfall of roughly $7.7 million. When you add the contingency, which is again, 2%, then you come to this, and I will say, in case someone's doing the math, 2% of our not, I look over at Supervisor Mills, 2% of our appropriation before declared disasters. So I kind of assumed those out and instead used what our normal appropriation would be. So that's that 2% of that number, which brings us to the $65.7 million, which is our estimated general fund shortfall going into this fiscal year. Breaking down also to give you an idea of where the general funds go, I think it's important to then see kind of, here you have on your appropriations, general government takes up about 20%, public safety 33% of the appropriations requests. Then you have declared disasters, which is taking up 27%, and then development services, records and land use at 11%, miscellaneous at 8%, and then your recreation, cultural, and the camera's in the way of the other one, is education. Thank you. Changing it to look at where the revenues are coming from. Miscellaneous, again, that's where your general fund property taxes, that's where your general fund sales taxes, your large discretionary revenues, that takes up about 42% of the revenues. Your declared disasters are actually bringing in about 27% because of the high amount of state and federal dollars that are coming in to address the disasters. Development services, records and land use 10%, public safety 10%, and education, recreation, and culture is below, it's not zero exactly, but it's below 1%. And then who's actually using the general fund? This is when you factor out appropriation and how much revenue they produce. You can see public safety is roughly 48% of your general fund use. Behind it, general government at 24%. Then you have the miscellaneous at 13%, declared disasters 7%, development services, records, land use at 6%, and then education, recreation, and cultural at 2%. Were there any questions on the budget, if it goes back, the budget requests before I move on to my recommended interim solutions? Okay. So obviously this budget represents a significant concern. We know that going into it, we're looking at an $8.65 million general fund shortfall. Now, again, this assumes that our revenue is remaining at a conservative level. This also assumes that our disaster response is going to be requiring $2.3 million, which, as we just learned, there's potential that that will be less, and I will certainly be updating those projections at that point. But that's also why I wanted to treat disaster response as a separate line item so we could see each of those as an item and address them differently, because each probably require a different response. And then we, again, are funding our contingencies at a minimum level. I don't like having a 2% contingency because it doesn't give us much room should something else happen through the fiscal year. But at the same time, at some point, if we're borrowing from a reserve or designated fund to shore up the general fund, well, then we can come back and adjust contingencies if we needed to. But at this point, I would recommend leaving the contingency fund at a minimum, since we're already utilizing some trust funds to really balance the budget. Recommendations. My recommendations this year are, I genuinely do see this as a stopgap measure to get us to a more long-term solution. The recommendations that I'm suggesting, going back when we started this current fiscal year, 16-17, we budgeted that we would use a $3.5 million transfer from the teeter fund. We also had a transfer in from a designated fund that's the 27th pay period. When the auditor and I met a couple weeks ago, we really looked at it, and the auditor's general feeling is we're probably going to wind down this fiscal year without using either of those two transfers. And I'm looking over to her in case something's changed that I'm unaware of. And basically we would end up with no fund balance. What I've looked at is we know we have been receiving some of our excise tax from cannabis funds. We have reasonable belief that we're going to have, at this point, reasonable belief that we would have at least the $1.5 million fund balance to carry over, probably more. However, I also think that we need to be setting some of those funds aside as a liability to until really the issue is decided. However, I think as a matter of conservative estimate, we can use $1.5 million of that to basically carry us in for fund balance going into the next fiscal year. And then we would also, I would look at using a transfer from the teeter fund of $1.831 million. Now you'll notice this is a deviation from the original proposal that I put forward. A transfer from the teeter fund of 1.83 million to 2.04. Now this coincides with number 5, which is the extra hire positions. In talking with a number of departments, most notably our public safety departments, there was some significant concern on position freezes in general, but also the extra hire positions, recognizing that some of those extra hire positions are tied to grant funding programs or are being used for very irregular work or purposes, that it's not going to be as easy to simply eliminate those extra hire positions. So what my proposal really here reflects is taking a little more a little more lenient approach to how we would look at those extra hire positions, and instead identify ones that could be reduced, but won't have a corresponding cost increase elsewhere by reducing those. So in essence, if we reduce this, it might cost us more by having to do a contracted service or some other activity that the extra hire position is helping with. And I think that needs to be a discussion with the departments as to how many positions there are, what that looks like. But what I did then is kind of left that a little flexible to provide some departmental input and opportunity for the board to consider, kind of a range.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
would there be a cost in eliminating those positions, such as unemployment insurance or something along those lines?
Let's look at Judy on HR for.
If they've been working, temporary positions, there's not the unemployment cost. If they were considered regular positions, there is an unemployment cost. One of the things, if we have had a position that it's still extra hire, but they've been with us a certain amount of time, unemployment may look at them as being a regular employee, and there would be a cost to us.
Do we have any idea what that cost would be, general numbers per person or per position, if they qualify? Would that be substantial, or is that?
Off the top of my head, I don't have those numbers, but depending on the numbers of people that could impact us because we are self-insured on unemployment, basically, so we pay the cost on a quarterly basis, and it could be a significant amount of money.
Okay, thank you.
Without delving into the issue right at this moment, I think it's really critical. This is the first time that I have had a budget without a position control list to work from, which is kind of unusual for me. So I would like to have a broader discussion on position freezes or on extra hire positions, but looking at it from all of the perspectives, including those positions that were funded but not filled, how long. There's a lot of other variables that should be played into this in terms of whether or not that was a cash accrued into the budget or whether it was simply moved to another department. So I don't want to discuss it at length right now, but I think it's an important part of our discussion as to how the employee, which represents a good portion of our budget, the employees play into this budget. So.
And we have plenty of reporting with regards to the permanent or limited term positions, even if it's a part-time permanent position. Extra hire positions, there is not control on those. So those are fairly loose, and the CAO and myself and HR have had a discussion that we probably need to shore that up. But at this time, I mean, we can give you what, I'm not sure the best way to do that.
My staff, I mean, we track all employees that are in all of the departments, including the extra hires that are in the department, but they do not have an individual position control number. Just like when I come to you, whenever we're adding a new position, that is giving the position a position control number. We do not do that with extra hire positions. So they are not formally tracked in the system, but we do track them informally. So we cannot just run reports with the weighted salaries. We have to do that independently. So we can get that information for you. It just takes a little bit more time.
I understand. I just don't want us to derail into some other sidebar discussion here, whether it's just to have this initial. I'm sorry. I don't want to derail into a sidebar discussion on this. I would like to just get through the initial presentation, and I would like to have it added as one of those discussions that I think we need to have. Thank you.
Thank you, noted. Charlotte?
All right. The other, or the third item on that list is transferring from our general fund reserve account. I tag this specifically as looking at our disaster response and utilizing our general fund reserve for that purpose. As much as I hate to use reserve, particularly when we added to it this year, I also feel that when you're looking at disaster, your reserve account is one of the, disasters are one of the reasons that you have a reserve account for a true rainy day, so to speak. And this to me seems like an appropriate use. The number that I chose wasn't necessarily random as much as it brought us down to our minimum 5% that we've worked to achieve. Again, we were trending above that this year. By using that amount, the 1.485, it would bring us back to that 5% level that really is kind of that minimum that we want to make sure that we carry and have. And then lastly is recommending that we consider freezing all positions. There are a number of areas where we looked at exemptions, and I'll get into that in more depth. In fact, let me take that one after I get to a later slide, and then we can talk about that and the implications. First, recapping the general fund reserve, the fund balance as of 6/30/16, so the beginning of this fiscal year, $2.4 million. We contributed through this year $2 million to bring us to the current balance of 4.463. So again, we added to it this year, and essentially I'd be recommending turning around and reducing it. Again, keeping us within the 5%, which is why I chose the number that I did choose. This is the summary of the teeter fund. Again, beginning balance for this year, 8.647. The budgeted transfers through the year, general fund contribution, increase to general fund reserve, which we just saw. Then contracts and positions, I believe those were mid-year budget adjustments, or
It was a combination, recommended final and in mid-year. There were several positions and contracts that were paid for through teeter.
okay. And in general, I'm trying to, from my office's standpoint now, create a more consistent policy on teeter. To me, those are one-time funds, one-time infrastructure projects that we need to be deliberate and thoughtful on how we're using that. So this really reflects a summary of what was done this year, and my hope is as we start to look at better policies and practices and bring those back to vet with the board, we can have a firm guidance for how we want to utilize these funds. The last one was the recently approved Blagan Bridge. That was basically the loan from teeter, or at least our hope of the loan from teeter, with the goal of going in after reimbursement for some or all of the costs of that bridge. Revenue, estimated revenue for the fiscal year, 1.2 million, which brings us to our estimated fund balance for closeout this year at $6.4 million. Now, getting to the point that I had said and why I figured it would be better to address it here, is this is the initial broad swath view of the hiring fee freeze recommendation. And I would caveat this on a couple of things. First of all, these numbers are fluid. They change at any given point based on if a department's already put in a hiring offer, a number that are out there. Obviously, we're not going to pull hiring offers because someone probably put in notice at their other employer. It also assumes that overtime costs don't increase, and that's a big assumption, obviously, because if you aren't filling some positions and you're trying to distribute workload, you could see overtime increases. These numbers assume 1 full year, and really, and I will caveat this with, I'm not a big fan of, well, I'm really not a fan of hiring freezes. What I see this doing is giving us a temporary option to bring the general fund into structural balance, where then as we get into the final segment of my presentation, we talk about some long-term recommendations and things that we need to look at from a broader policy level. For the purposes of needing a budget passed by the statutory June 30 deadline, we do need to come up with some structural options that either bring in additional revenue or reduce expenses. This is one way to reduce expenses. Certainly, there are other options that we can look at. The trick here is timing from now until June 30, or really the 27th, the next time the board's scheduled, or the time the board's scheduled to meet to really adopt a recommended budget, on what adjustments we can make. So I think as some of the departments provide presentations, there might be some discussion about options that we might have to reduce how many of those salaries might need to be frozen. I recognize particularly that there is a huge impact to our public safety programs within this recommendation, and that is in contrast to this board's previous stated budget priority. At the same time, trying to identify and carve out certain programs was going to be really problematic when the bulk of your expenditures are lying within those public safety programs at the same time. And so this, is kind of that starting place of this brings our budget into balance so that we can then do some of the hard work that's going to be required to get us into September and an adopted final budget. And my last note there, and I had sent a note over to the auditor, and I'm hoping she and I can meet when we, at the conclusion of budget hearings, to kind of talk about how we want to do hiring freezes if that's the direction that we're going to go. I don't necessarily like how we do our unfunded positions, because I think the parking lot creates a position control nightmare for both HR and the auditor for how we track positions. It's not a good position control mechanism. So there's got to be a different way that we do that. Whether if it's a short-term temporary freeze, creating a controlled salary saving budget line within the budget that indicates that you are, budgeting that you're not going to fill these positions, and you identify which positions are in that salary savings line, and then you can reconcile that at a quarterly level, at annual or semi-annual level. It's kind of up to your discretion. So there are a couple ways to do that, and I'm trying to look at different ways rather than relying on the old practice that I think creates some new challenges for everyone. So wrapping up really is looking at our long-term strategies. First of all, we know the challenges that we face today are truly longer-term structural issues. The unfunded pension liabilities are not going to go away anytime soon. We know that we have continual cost increases in social services programs based on mandates, in-home supportive services being a very large example of that. Locally right now, we're still having the next, at least foreseeable period, tree mortality, not to mention the cleanup from winter storms. We still need to address our large disaster response costs. And we have a high number of job classifications that are outside of the pay averages for that classification, that are out of parity. And at some point, we need to address that because it creates the recruitment challenges for us. And generally, and I put in that blank years and forgot to update my slide for how many years it was when I asked Judy to give me a number, but I think when we went back, it was 2015 when we had increases last time.
January of 2015 was 4% increase.
Okay. So no cost of living payments to our workers now for the last 3 years then is where my placeholder was that didn't get put into my final slide. And then really, as we know, we have massive deferred maintenance costs for all of our buildings here at the government campus, and we really need to address those. In addition to, we have some of our departments that are in subpar buildings that we really need to address. If our DA's in here, I'm sure she would be. We clearly need to come up with long-term solutions, and I know a number of board members have been asking for an updated space plan. That is one of the biggest priorities on my department's list, because we need to identify what our space plan is and then also what our costs are going to be to address the deferred maintenance across the campus. So looking at all of those factors, I recognize that these are long-term. We're not going to solve them with freezing positions, and clearly we can't solve them with transfers from limited designated funds, because the funds aren't enough to address the problems in totality, and clearly freezing positions is not an effective way to manage our expenses. So what, coming in new to the county, and I think, again, with a board of 4 new members coming in to look at this, I think this does present an opportunity of us really needing to look at how we do business and begin making significant structural changes. And how we do that could be a number of different ways. But I think we really need to, at a minimum, look at examining and enhancing revenue-producing activities across the county, evaluate our internal service departments. I alluded to facilities, I alluded to IT. There are a number of areas where I think we could create true internal service funds within the county, and while it doesn't, that alone doesn't save cost, what it starts to do is drive behavior. If you create an ISF and a department is charged for their share of using those services, it starts to create a little more accountability within the department on how they're utilizing those services, whether it's custodial, whether it's maintenance, whether it's information technology. But I think there are better opportunities to create a more formalized ISF structure and not rely solely on the way we distribute costs through our A87 cost plan. And I know number 3 is always a challenge, and that's reviewing our fee schedule and update accordingly. I do agree with the budget principle that you don't balance a budget by raising fees, but I do think you do need to account for the periodic cost of doing business, and that continues to go up. We have a number of fees that haven't been updated in 10 years, and 10-year-old fees definitely are a problem for me because, one, you could have situations where you're overcharging if you're looking 10 years ago when we were staffed at a higher level, and other spots we're probably undercharging, and really looking at our fees, either bringing them up or bringing them down depending on the particular department. I think we need to begin that exercise. The number 4, I think, is really the most critical, is really reviewing an established long-term strategic business and management plan for the county with county priorities and performance goals. And then you could start to evaluate department budgets and programs through that lens, and ensure that there's alignment of all of those departments to the county's priority objectives. Really, these budget hearings could take on a very different look if you're developing a performance system and goals and expectations that are laid out within departments' budget requests, and approving increases or changes based on, are you meeting what the county's goals are and the performance metrics that are being established? That's a lot of work, it's a significant culture change, and it's going to take time to get there. But I do think, based on the totality of challenges facing the county, looking at it from the lens of how do we look at this from a more strategic point of view, I think is going to be critical. Lastly, there are a number of fiscal policies regarding our use of reserves, and I alluded to that on how we're using some of our designated funds. Capital projects, budgeting priorities, I think we need to look at all of those in light of the other items. Formalizing policies and practice to promote greater economies of scale. I know I've shared with a number of board members my concern where, purchasing policies, how we're, coordinating ordering of services, how we're, doing bids for contracts. We really need to start to look at that. And developing long-term space and capital improvement plans, which I also alluded to before, because that really needs to be factored into whatever recommendation we make. We need to start to look at these buildings more as this is a cost of doing business, is to make sure that we're investing in the work to maintain those buildings and keep them up, address problems so that we don't run into a situation that we've had now, a lot of deferred maintenance. And I think, lastly, in closing, what struck me through this budget cycle is, Supervisor Mills, you alluded to it with your position control list. And it's one piece of, I think, a broader area of ways that we need to also look at and invest in some technology to assist our workforce in doing their job more effectively. For instance, the position control list, they can get the reports from the auditor's office, but then there's some manual reconciliation that Judy and her staff have to do at HR to do some verifications through some of the information. This county does not have a true human resources information system. Without having a human resources information system, it creates a logistical nightmare for HR whenever I'm asking for updated data and information. And negotiations are a prime example where Judy's working into the weekend and the evening to try and run statistics on the fly because it doesn't easily come out of the system. I think there are a lot of opportunities to look at that. Unfortunately, some of those activities cost funds, albeit often one-time funds, but when you're looking at the potential savings by freeing up staff time to focus on other tasks that they haven't been able to get to, it ultimately does save money because you don't have to add more positions to do it. So with that, again, I want to thank the board for their support through this process, through their patience of waiting for the budget binder. I know I wanted to get it out a little sooner, but also trying to learn and work through some of our manual processes. It did take a little longer than I would have liked. So I do very much appreciate the patience and the support. My office staff have been wonderful in making sure they got everything pulled together, tried to catch things. The county auditor also exceptionally helpful in helping with projections, helping me navigate and learn the IFAS system. Human Resources, again, Judy and her staff pulling a lot of reports into the weekend and evening, so thank you. And then our departments, the department heads and the fiscal staff who met, provided information. I appreciate all of that. Any budget, regardless of size, size doesn't always matter on complexity. Just looking at the number of work product papers from this, so it really is a team effort. So I want to thank all of the people who helped make this budget or helped get it done. And then lastly is just a recommendation that, one, we conduct public hearing on fiscal year 17-18 budget, that the board receive presentation by CAO on the recommended budget, provide direction on any changes to the recommended budget, and then on the June 27th conclusion of the public hearings to adopt a recommended budget with requested adjustments, position change resolution to include additions, deletions, reclassifications, adopting the capital asset purchase resolution, and special district designated fund resolution. And that's it.
Thank you, CAO. That's a heck of a presentation. Good job. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be taking a 10-minute break right now so we can digest this and come back. See you in 10 minutes. I was ready to go. No.
There it goes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have public comment right now on the overview presentation by CAO Lutz. But keep in mind that we have departments, staff that will be making more presentations. So if you have public comments on those, you may want to reserve those. We'd like to have public comment on what's been presented so far. Okay? So at this time, if you have public comments on the overview, you're limited to 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, Bonnie Newman from Double Springs. I just have one comment about something that was mentioned. that collective bargaining for IHSS has returned to the counties, and if in 9 months progress isn't made, then PERB will be contacted. That's telling me that they think the county would be out of compliance with bargaining, so PERB would be involved. My position is the union is out of compliance, having neglected us for 7 years, and they're going to call PERB on you guys. As far as I know, the county's been willing to step up, but the union has been reluctant to engage in collective bargaining. So my feeling about calling PERB could backfire on the unions, because they're the ones, well, my union, SEIU 2015, has been, well, what's the word I want to say? Kristen gave me a real professional word once, but I'll just say our union has really sucked in representing its members. That's what I have to say, is they've been out of compliance or whatever it is. They have been the ones that have been failing. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Any other public comment?
That's a hard act to follow. Allison County Taxpayer Association. Several things. These are not my own ideas. I try to find somebody intelligent and ask their opinion, and then try to remember what they said, and because it seemed to make sense. So one of them is some of our departments you have to, in setting wages, you have to compare to other areas because they would attract our people. If your goal is to keep and retain good employees, you need to be competitive. But you don't need to pay more than you need to pay. Now, other classifications are comparable to the private sector. We think you should compare that to the private sector for evaluation, because a person has a choice of going to work for government or work for the private sector. And that's competitive. You're not likely to lose people if you're competitive with the private sector type job. We don't know how we compare to other similar counties. Are we top heavy in comparison? Like if there's 1,000 population, how many bureaucrats do we have? I mean, how many public employees do we have? And how does that compare with other similar counties? If we're lean and mean, that's great. But if we're top heavy, we probably need to reevaluate the structures and find out how other counties are able to be more efficient with less people. That's enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scala. Any further public comment? Okay, seeing none. Sheriff? Jim?
I'm their sheriff now. I can call him Jim. I don't have to call him Captain Macedo. It's kind of nice. Feels weird, though, I will say. Good afternoon, board. We have a presentation. Captain Macedo is going to start it off, and then I'll fall in, and we'll be bouncing back and forth between the two of us.
Good afternoon, Jim Macedo, Captain from the Sheriff's Office. We're going to jump right into a PowerPoint. Normally, I would say please interrupt me if you have questions with respective or specific slides. However, this presentation kind of builds towards the end, and it addresses a lot of the information that's been brought before you today, yet affects the Sheriff's Office specifically. So you may want to wait till the end, because I may be answering some of your questions towards the latter portion of the PowerPoint. But if it's a burning question, ask it, and I'll tell you whether it's addressed later on. Okay? Okay. I didn't spend a lot of time with an overview, so we're going to jump into the next slide, please. The sheriff's budget, if you could pay particular attention to the 16-17 actual budget, was listed at $15.9 million. This year, our proposed budget, you can see, is a $0.7 million reduction. And then in contrast, the CAO's recommended budget is a significant reduction down to $13.8 million. Please remember those numbers when I talk about the amount of revenue the Sheriff's Office generates on behalf of the county for balancing. Another important fact that I know you're all curious about, we have 119 total positions. Those are both general fund positions, contract, grant, revenue, that's in total. And as of today, we have 16 vacancies. Next slide. I want to address savings to the county, and this is a bit of a rhetorical question, but the question that I'm going to ask is, what would the county do if we were not generating this revenue? How would the county offset this revenue if it were to go away? Specifically, the Friends of the Sheriff donations, which I know were sort of brought before you this morning. Program revenue, grants and contracts, $1.2 million. Other revenue of $145,000 and change. Designated fund revenue, some of which is directly funneled to the Sheriff's Office, for a total of $2.63 million. And when you're looking at, roughly a $15 million budget and you're almost at $3, the Sheriff's Office is generating on its own $1 for every 3 it's receiving from the county. And that's a little abnormal. Normally the general fund contribution is much heavier than that compared to what revenue is being generated. And if you look at the Sheriff's Office overall, probably with the exception of Public Works, which gets large funding for large projects, and Health and Human Services, we're generating more revenue than just about any other general fund department in the county. And I bring that to your attention because if that were to go away, then the general fund would have to compensate for that, but there's a workload that's tied to that revenue that I'll address later on. In addition, non-monetary, but they do cost, are the search and rescue volunteers. Those folks supplement Sheriff's Office employees. They're actually actively out working today on a plane crash. Sheriff's Office volunteers that do an incredible amount of work. And lastly, you have the inmate work crew that's being supported by probation that does a bunch of asset protection around the government center and landscaping. Next slide. Our major budgets, the big one is patrol, and the request this year is $6.6 million with a $6 million cost to the county offsetting the revenue. There are currently 42 entire positions in patrol, 6 of which are vacant. Those vacancies are general fund vacancies. The patrol, some highlights of the patrol budget include a $638,000 overtime budget, which is incredibly high. Obviously, you've had some mid-year presentations about low staffing, which is driving that, which is why we're incredibly concerned by the CAO's recommendation to freeze positions. Vehicle maintenance, that number is inaccurate. I'm not sure why it just says 11,000. I know it's considerably higher than that. Capital asset request, you're going to notice a request for new vehicles from our office. We'll talk about which ones we're requesting the general fund pay for, in addition to the funds we are going to pay for. We're also including the Sheriff Services Tech, which was from OES, incorporating that back into our budget as part of our request. And then, as has been discussed with the board, we have a trainee academy program, which we're requesting to fund at $152,000. That'll put 10 deputies into the academy for the entire fiscal year. It'll be 2 groups of 5. And we'll talk about our vacancy rate and our average vacancy rate and our numbers of employees leaving the office and why we're pushing towards that number 10. We also are requesting some, it's called extra help, but that's just a breakdown. Those are extra hire. The number 4 there, that's actually academy positions. And we had to categorize them differently because we manage them differently if they come from the outside and we're placing them in the academy, or if they're an existing employee, such as somebody from the jail that we're putting through the academy. The costs are a little different because of some benefits. An additional request that it says it's not included, but essentially it was the 4 vacant positions from AB 443. The Sheriff's Office made a request to bring that back under the Sheriff's Office. That is the rural Sheriff's funds that had been used to offset general fund costs for a number of years. So we are making a motion to bring that back where it rightfully should be. Next slide. Okay, I've mentioned this to the board, and I tried to lay out a slide that explains what's going on with our hiring process and what happens when you become overly dependent upon grants and contracts and designated funds as opposed to general fund positions. With general fund positions, you have a lot of flexibility on what you can utilize that staff for. The county pays for those out of the general fund, And right now, we only have 12 active patrol deputies that are being paid out of the general fund. And then in addition to that, we have 2 detectives and a sergeant. And then there's the marine safety program in its entirety where there's a $99,000 cost. As we bring employees on to the sheriff's office, we would like to fill those general fund positions. Those general fund positions are the ones that serve your constituents as the board. They don't serve specialized districts or areas. They serve your constituents at the board. Those are important. Those are what we call good positions. They're very flexible, and there's not a big giant paper trail or chase or a lot of staff work every time we move them from one location to another. They pretty much move freely. On the right-hand side, you have our contract, grant, and designated fund positions, and I want to talk about imbalance because when you look at court security, the 4 plus the 1 extra hire, the Comanche contract, which is 1 3/4 of person, the Hogan, which is the Army Corps of Engineers contract, U.S. Forest Service is very small, the Maloney's, which is 1 entire person, the Assembly Bill 109 money, which is basically our employee that's attached to probation to deal with those getting out of prison, off-highway vehicle, marine safety, and then the marijuana funds. We have an imbalance. We have 16 deputies, essentially, that are being paid for by grant and contract positions. Those have to be filled, otherwise we don't bring the revenue in. If we don't bring the revenue in, then the CAO will most likely recommend that our budget get lowered to the amount that revenue comes into the county or the sheriff's office. And that is, again, not normal. That's an imbalance. And we need to get back to where the general fund is supplying deputy sheriffs, and I'll talk about workload as it relates to those contracts and designated funds in the next slide, Maria. So what happens, the county supports the hiring of a new employee, and we want that new employee to come in and get assigned to patrol, to go out and work the community, to work, again, your constituents, work a beat, handle calls for service, respond to emergencies, and what have you. So essentially, you would want them coming into that left-handed column. The problem is when we have a vacancy and the person that leaves the agency, when they're in a grant or contracted or funded position, that employee that comes in is not being funded through the general fund. We are having to kick them over to the grant to fulfill those grants and contracts. This is a problem at the sheriff's office. It's a problem we cannot manage without some help from the board, specifically related to general fund dollars. What has happened over the years, we've become, especially through the recession, incredibly dependent upon grant and contract positions. So when you hire somebody in, we're looking to fill that left-handed side, that general fund position. The problem is they're immediately getting kicked over to those other positions, so you are constantly having a vacancy, okay, in the general fund, which ties back to your general patrol and investigative status. So those that pay are getting service. Those constituents that are paying tax dollars essentially are getting shorted, and that needs to be corrected, and we'll talk about how to do that. Next slide. This is all kind of a repeat of what I mentioned below, and we'll talk about that more towards the end. Next slide.
This kind of goes towards the staffing levels, and I know you've heard this before, especially for the board members that have been here for a little bit. I have 3 deputies on patrol at any given time during the day. We run 2 squads, and you have an A squad and a B squad. So you have a day shift and a graveyard shift because we're running 12-hour days. So at any given time, you have 3 guys and hopefully a sergeant. If we don't have a sergeant because they're out sick, vacation, or whatever the case may be, we have to call somebody in on overtime to fulfill, because our MOU states that they have to have a minimum of 4 deputies on the streets or 3 deputies and a sergeant. The problem with that, as Mr. Oliveira, you know, working the streets, it is unsafe. That is 1,100 square miles of area that these folks have to cover with 3 guys. And what it does is it's causing a problem for our calls for service times are going up. Because if you have a guy in Copperopolis and he has a call in Arnold or Dorrington, he has to drive from Copperopolis to Dorrington to get there because there's nobody else in between. Because you have one guy working one side of the county, being Arnold to Copper, and the other guy working from West Point to Wallace, and then you have a guy that tries to float back and forth to assist. So it makes it very difficult to get to these calls for service in a timely manner. So again, this will roll back to the CAO's recommendation about freezing these positions. It's going to cause a problem with our staffing levels. We need to get our staffing levels back up. And this is something that not only myself, Dennis Downham, and Sheriff Kuntz have been advocating for years, that we need to get staffing levels back up. We have less deputies now than what we had in 2002, and that's not a good thing. We have more grant people too than what we have on the other side. Next slide. This was marijuana. The MCCRP screws me up. I keep thinking of MRSA. This is our marijuana program. We're requesting the 1.2, but in that 1.2, it also accounts for 3 deputy positions that have been vacant since the inception of this program. We originally started with 2 deputies and a sergeant. I have, about a month and a half ago, moved another deputy into that program. So I have 3 vacant positions right now. One of the requests, as you see at the bottom of that, is to move a lieutenant into that position through the marijuana program to assist, because I have a sergeant who is he's trying to manage people and manage mid-management level items, purchasing, getting helicopters, and putting these programs together to do these eradications. He can't do all of that. I need some help in there. So it ends up being, that's not in that slide, but it's a $128,000 savings by adding the lieutenant and foregoing those 3 deputy positions right now. We're also looking at 2 box trailers. That is going to save us, the county, money down the road, because we won't have to have the big dump trucks come in from the road department to haul a lot of this material out. Right now is the time where we have the 806 program up and running. They're able to get to these plants at a younger stage, doesn't take as much area, so they can do that if we had these box trailers to do it themselves, because they can be towed behind a pickup. I think they're 6 feet wide and I think 12 or 14 feet long with 4-foot sides. You can haul a lot of small marijuana plants in that. So that's another one of the requests. And bringing that other lieutenant on, we need the computer and the cell phone. Next slide. I'll let Jim take this one.
As the sheriff mentioned, right now we have a sergeant who is supervising 2 newer deputy sheriffs in the marijuana program. And while those 2 deputy sheriffs are working hard, they are relatively inexperienced, or at least they were. So what we have is a sergeant trying to supervise 2 brand new people, essentially, due to our staffing turnover. And he's constantly being torn in a couple different directions. The sheriff mentioned the helicopter contracts and the large amount of equipment that had to be purchased, in addition to managing the staff, managing the case, helping out with those cases. We don't want that sergeant spending a lot of time in the office. We want that sergeant in the field with his staff. We also want that sergeant we want that sergeant working with the staff so that the lieutenant can coordinate with the other county departments, specifically code enforcement, some allied outside agencies that are assisting us, and in addition, the county counsel's office and our planning department that's handling the inspections and registration. We also have some support staff that are working in marijuana, non-sworn clerical staff. They're also new to the organization, new to law enforcement, and they are not being supervised because the sergeant essentially is being torn in several different directions. So we're trying to fix that imbalance. Next slide. This is just another representation of what's going on. Basically, the marijuana impacts the ongoing criminal investigations, the registration process, inspections and backgrounds, and the county budget and purchasing process is outweighing the accurate or current staff load we have in there. So we want to bring that lieutenant in, fund it through the marijuana fund, and have that new person acting as a coordinator between all the county departments, and then having middle management oversight of the program as it relates to the sheriff's office. Next slide.
This is our dispatch and our records department. The request is 1.4, county cost is $1 million. Right now I have 10 dispatchers. I don't know if Judy Hawkins is still here or not, but her and our past CAO, Shirley Ryan, I had them do a tour of the jail, and I had them do a tour of our dispatch center. And you remember that right now I have 12 deputies on the street. I have 10 dispatchers. They work the same time. They work 12 hours, or they work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Do the math. 10 dispatchers is not enough. Again, there's a lot of overtime that is involved in that. We have 6, and I have 1 vacant position. One of the positions that is in there is one of the positions that CA wants to freeze. So it's going to put a hinder. When you start freezing positions and you don't allow us to put people in place, now you're looking at people coming in on overtime. They're already working a 12-hour shift, and now they have to hold over for another 4 hours to get coverage. It's going to make it very difficult on these folks. Again, part of the overtime there. And then we do have a sergeant's position that was part of dispatch. Half of it was dispatch, half of it was OES. And CAO, I didn't hear you talk about it unless I missed about you taking back OES, the program. In that transition, he's going to refund that other half of the position for that sergeant that does half OES right now and half dispatch. So it'll all come out of the dispatch program at that time. Next slide. Again, the jail, same thing. I had the CAO, and I've asked Mr. Lutz to come in and take a tour of the jail. We have a control center in our jail that operates every door, everything within the jail, and right now it is manned with 1 person. I have 3 sheriff's techs that are in that jail right now, and we're utilizing deputies or correctional officers, to fill when that person needs to use a restroom, take a break, have lunch, whatever the case may be. So I had originally requested, when you folks gave me 5 correctional officers, well, it was board last year, I'm sorry. They gave me 5 correctional officers. I asked for 3 more correctional technicians to work inside that control room and another sergeant to oversee for some supervision, because I only have 2 sergeants right now to supervise the whole jail staff along with the lieutenant. So again, we're back to the staffing levels in the jail are low. Remember, when you raise the staffing levels on the street or people start making more arrests because there's more going on, that means there's more going on inside of the jail. If there's more going on inside the jail, that means there's more going on inside the courts. If there's more going on inside the courts, that means there's more going on in probation. It's a big circle that encompasses the whole safety program. So this here is, there's 5 vacant positions there. The CAO decided to not incorporate those into those frozen positions because of our staffing levels. Again, overtime. The overtime is a big issue because we're short-staffed. We've been actively recruiting people with the help of HR. We've been doing better, but we still have people leaving. And then we did pull 1 officer over to the patrol side. So, next slide.
Maria, can I get you to go back to the dispatch slide real quick? So I talked about contract and grant positions, and dispatch. This is a small yet easy to understand example of that. There is 1 position slated on the CAO's recommendation to freeze of a vacant dispatcher position. We have a contract with an ambulance company to provide them a service. We have a contract with the City of Angels Camp to provide them a service. They are paying for those services out of the contract. But when you remove general fund dollars, the workload is still there, yet you have less staff to do it. And that's exactly what our patrol contracts are doing. That's why it's so critical that you do not remove general fund dollars from the sheriff's office, especially a sheriff's office that's laden with grant and contract duties, because you are actually sucking away resources that you've committed to at a previous time. Not just this board, but previous boards. Next slide. Actually, if you could jump forward, please, to jump forward to. Okay, with respect to the Office of Emergency Services, the sheriff had a meeting with the CAO, and there was some discussions about removing OES. That is a part of a much larger discussion, and while the sheriff has indicated some initial support for that, there are some issues that need to be addressed as it relates to that transition. I believe that needs to be a separate meeting and study session unto itself, because there's some funding tied to that budget that pays for communications that I'm not sure the board nor the CAO is aware of, specifically emergency radio communications towers and contracts for cell phones within the sheriff's office. Those are incorporated into the Office of Emergency Services budget, and it's part of the larger program. And I'd be hesitant to think that we would flip a switch and try and transition that overnight or in a relatively short period of time. That is going to have to be a transitional process where we sit down, meet, confer, and agree on timelines, especially since we're coming up upon a fire season right now. And the county does have some contractual commitments relating to communications that are tied to that OES budget that are going to negatively affect the sheriff's office if those funds are pulled away. Next slide. ADA JAG, these are pretty much simple transfers. The sheriff's office had an ADA JAG grant for combating controlled substances other than marijuana. That grant is set to expire in December of this year, so that revenue is going away. In return, we are going to use some existing position numbers and staff with some other designated fund grant savings we had in lieu of laying off employees. So we had basically saved and utilized some money in a separate designated fund. Otherwise, we would be laying off additional sworn staff as it relates to the end of that grant cycle. Next slide.
Our patrol vehicles, we've talked about this before, and you'll see in the later slides the requests that we're making for general fund contributions towards vehicles, along with some funding that we're going to supply out of AB 443. Most departments are getting rid of their vehicles between 75 and 100,000 miles. I have actually talked with CHP, San Joaquin County, and Stanislaus County to try and utilize some of their vehicles because they're getting rid of them around 90 to 100,000 miles. Stanislaus and San Joaquin County, they use them for their skid car programs, which is their practice cars for their officers. So by the time they get rid of them, they've got 200,000 miles on them, and the wheels are actually literally falling off of them because they beat the hell out of them. So that wasn't an option. And CHP, the cost, years ago, CHP used to give the vehicles to departments, and if you were done with the vehicle, you gave it back. Like some of the stuff we get from our DRMO. We can utilize it, but we have to give it back. Well, I guess there was some entities out there that complained about that, so they decided that they would sell them to the departments for $1. Well, again, cause more problems down the road, because when they take these vehicles with 100,000 miles and they can sell them on auction for $7,000, that money was going back into the state's general fund, so that program got canceled now too. So I talked to Commissioner Farrow up at the CHP probably about 4 months ago to talk to them about buying their vehicles, and they're looking at a lot of money for their vehicles. They're not just going to give them away anymore. So purchasing vehicles that are used was not going to be an option. So maintenance costs of our vehicles are going up because and you'll see, go ahead, next slide, that we're getting a lot of these vehicles that have over 100,000 miles on them. I got 9 4x4 units right now that are assigned to patrol. 4 of them are in excess of 200,000 miles. One of them is my K9 unit that we're just in the process of replacing. I think actually it did get replaced now. I have 3 in excess of 190,000, 5 over 100,000, and 3 of them have less than 100,000, and there are still some new cars that are not reflected on there that are newer cars. Next slide. Here's some of the vehicles with the higher mileages. As you can see, anywhere from a low of 100,000 clean up to 249,000 miles. It's a lot of miles for an emergency vehicle. I'm a mechanic by trade from many, many years ago. A lot of you folks know the vehicle that I drive on my off days. These vehicles are unsafe to be driven at pursuit speed. They're absolutely unsafe, but yet we're requiring our guys to do that because they still have a job to do. Next slide. Here's what we were talking about. General fund, we're looking at an expedition, 2 Ford 4x4 pickups. I found that we can purchase the 4x trucks and outfit them for a little bit less than what it costs for an expedition, and 1 Ford sedan, not to exceed $291,000. The AB 443 money, I would like to bring that money back, as the CEO we talked about earlier. Those funds are designed for non-discretionary funds for the Sheriff's Department for doing exactly this, purchasing vehicles. The RIMS program that we use in patrol program and throughout the sheriff's department right now was paid exclusively by AB 443 monies. None of that money came out of the general fund. So that's what those funds are designed to do. That's why I want to bring those funds back. So these would be vehicles to replace the older retired vehicles that need to be retired through our detectives and our other patrol staff. There is an AB 109 vehicle that we're going to be getting. That'll be coming from probation, and we will be giving them back one of the vehicles in exchange for the new vehicle that they're going to be purchasing for the deputy that works ABO 109. Next slide. These are some of the recommendations that the CAO made. These are the salary savings that $104,000 or $1.4 million. I had him give me the position numbers. I think Mr. Mills, you talked about the position numbers. I want to kind of go through those real quick and kind of give you an idea of those position numbers. 3 of those position numbers are tied to the marijuana program, so they're irrelevant. I have another position that is tied to CalEMA, so that is an irrelevant cost. I have 4 positions that right now are tied to AB 443, but technically would be part of the freeze that he's talking about. Those 4 positions would be tied to the general fund at that time, and then the other 2 positions. So I would have a total of 6 positions that would actually be tied to general fund positions. The rest of them are not, because they are grant positions, the CalEMA and the 3 MRSA program. The dispatch clerk, again, that particular position is an unfilled position. The dispatcher that was there just left and went over to Tuolumne County. Mr. Mills, we had an offline conversation. You wanted to know how long. That dispatcher's only been gone for about maybe 2 months. That very top corporal's position, he's only been gone for a month. He went into the marijuana program. The other corporal, the one that says Gillespie next to it, I think it does say Gillespie up there. The 3243, he quit and went down to San Joaquin County DA's office. And then the one at the very bottom, that is a CalEMA grant. And I see Jim walking up, so he's got something to say.
I just want to clarify a point that the sheriff's trying to make for the board. And this is where I think we're going to need to sit down with the CAO and address some issues. The list of numbers that we've been provided that he's proposing to make up the amount of money he wants to cut from our office, they aren't general fund positions from what we've seen. They are non-general fund positions. So we're going to need to sit down and have a meeting and figure out where we're missing each other. In addition, no matter which way we try, and I had Maria, who's far sharper than I am, try to get to the same number that the CAO did within our own cuts, and we couldn't get there. The total's different. So there's clearly a disconnect with what the CAO is proposing and what the reality is from within our agency and position numbers. So the costs that were shown to you today from the sheriff's office, we're unable to match those up and make those work. And not just because we don't want to, but because they're not general fund positions, so you're not going to realize any savings from reducing those positions.
Well, and the caveat to that is that, remember we told you that we have 5 positions for the academy. Right now I have 3 guys in the academy, and we just went down and recruited to try and get 2 more to take those 5 positions so that when the academy is over, we have 5 recruits come out. Well, when those 5 recruits come out, if AB 443 is back into the general fund positions, there's 5 positions that are going to be full. So technically, there's only 2 positions up there that are not going to be filled by the time the academy is over with. So it's not an accurate cost savings. I just want to make sure that you're clear of that. And I think I've talked to some of you board members offline. I'm trying to get our investigation division back up. We have 2 investigators to work the whole county, and with what we've got going on in this county, they're just overrun. They're up there dealing with this airplane crash right now too. So the 2 corporal positions that are up there are going to probably be the 2 positions that I would be freezing. So it's going to cause some problems. Next slide. Again, right now, the CAO and us, we need to sit down and talk a little bit more so that we're all on the same page. Recruiting, you folks have given us, and the past board gave us the opportunity to start recruiting people. We're getting to a position to where we're actually starting to make some headway. And with the COO's recommendations, it's going to stop that. It's going to freeze that opportunity. Next slide. The cost, oh yeah, you got some numbers. Go ahead.
Sorry, these numbers came in a little late, and so I didn't get to plug them into the actual slide. So we did a staffing analysis, and I want to talk about the impacts of slowing down recruiting and the complications of stopping or slowing the hiring process. Right now, we are averaging 8.5 sworn people leaving our agency every year. That means we know we've got to hire 8.5 people next year, roughly, no matter what, in order to just tread water, which is we're well below where we should be. We're averaging 1 dispatcher leave per year and 7.8 jail employees leave per year. So totaling those up, we know for a fact we've got to recruit 16 people and put them to work next year, or we're going to continue to go in the wrong direction. The cost impacts of slowing down or stopping recruiting, because I've been through a hiring freeze with this county before, the recruiting and hiring process, if you could jump forward, it's a little bit like a machine, and it's very hard to get it started once you stop it. And it's incredibly hard to get it started in Calaveras County for reasons that we'll address maybe later. But I want to walk you through our hiring system so you understand it, and this is the most time I've ever spent on trying to explain our hiring process. But in order to recruit an employee, it roughly takes us about 2 months just to get them to the table and apply. After we get them to the table, we usually have to schedule a test. That test is usually about a month out. So right there, we're at 3 months. Once we've tested that employee and we decide we want to hire him or her, we do a background. If that employee is young and they've lived relatively few places, we can get that background done quickly meaning about 2 months. If it is a person that's had a lot of life experience, has moved all over the place, had lots of different jobs, it can take as long as 6 months. So right there, we're at 9 months, and we're still talking about a background. Our medical psych testing right now with the county's had some hurdles. They're doing the best they can, but HR's had some issues with some of the folks that we contract with. It's taken us 1 to 2 months to get both the medical and the psych done on the employee, so we're looking at almost a year right there. To send a sworn employee through the academy, right now we're having to fight for academy spots because there are so many academies or law enforcement agencies throughout the state that we're getting turned away from certain academies or told we can only put 2 in when we want to put 4 in. The academy on the short end academy is 6 months. The long extended academy that allows the employees to work is 9 months. So we're up almost to 2 years. And lastly, when we train somebody, it's a 16-week FTO program, and before that employee actually fills a slot, fills a hole, they have to go through the training program. They cannot fill a vacant spot in our organization per guidelines, not just our own, but the state's guidelines. They have to go through a training program. So we're looking at 17 months to 25 months to get an employee in. So if you stop us today and you put a hiring freeze on the county, or the sheriff's office, you're looking at the potential for 17 to 25 months before we start plugging holes again. And this is not hyperbole, but that's dangerous. I've been through it before. It's dangerous because you end up with short shifts, understaffed shifts, and you end up with folks in fights, folks getting hurt, delayed calls for people showing up, delays in answering 911, delayed response in the jail for correctional officers wrestling with an inmate. So it is not just a turn switch. You flip it and we freeze it, we can start it up in a couple weeks again. It's a problem. And it's not just a problem for the sheriff's office, it's a problem for HR because they have to start the whole recruitment process with the newspaper and reestablishing contacts with candidates. Next slide. Sheriff's office recommendations. We're going to summarize these, but we're going to go bullet point by bullet point here in a moment. The extra help, that is the academy students for the current 4 that are in the academy. We're requesting $60,000 to fund those 4 to get them into the academy. The vehicle request is $291,500 for the vehicles the sheriff mentioned. and then the Assembly Bill 443. Essentially, those are vehicles the Sheriff's Office is going to pay for out of the rural sheriff's funds for the unmarked vehicles. Next slide. And these are the things we're going to ask you to vote on. We know you're probably not going to be voting as far as budgetary matters until tomorrow or the next day, but I want to be crystal clear because we have left here before without the board giving the CAO's office and the Sheriff's Office clear direction. When it comes time, I would like to request that the board vote on each one of these items one by one, so that we walk away completely clear. HR does, the auditor does, there's no confusion moving forward. We want to be, number one, exempted from the recommended hiring freeze and position freeze. We want those 10 academy positions that we know we're going to have to fill funded. We want the vehicle requests funded, both the general fund obligation and the AB 443 obligation. The lieutenant that the sheriff spoke about for the marijuana program. In addition to that, and I'll leave it up to other people to argue whether this is going to cost any money. Supervisor Mills and I think the CAO and the previous CAO, Mr. Lopez, agreed it is incredibly complicated that the marijuana budget has been inserted into the patrol budget. I'll stop short of calling it commingling, but it's been inserted in there and it overinflates our budget. It leads the uneducated viewer to believe we have a hell of a lot more money in our budget than we actually do. That marijuana money needs to be separated out, put on a side, and needs to be addressed on its own, entirely separate from patrol. We don't want any confusion, and for the last year and a half, it's led to confusion up and down just about every week. It's been a problem. And I don't want to say it doesn't cost any money, but it doesn't look like it costs any money. Lastly, you're going to hear from the district attorney's office relating to the marijuana program. There is a lot of nefarious business involved with marijuana. It should be no surprise to anybody, and we are in support of doing a joint forensic accountant between the sheriff's office and the DA so we can start looking at some financial matters that we believe are going on with respect to some marijuana growers. And then lastly, if there is in fact a ban, the board is going to have to step up and fund the sheriff's office so we can deal with those residual impacts relating to marijuana in the future. Last slide. At this point, we will take any questions you have. I apologize for jumping around a little bit, but we're ready for questions.
Any questions of the sheriff and Captain Macedo on the board? Staff?
I also, again, I think part of the challenge, as I alluded to in our presentation, is trying to reconcile costs between departments. On the one thing that stuck out at me was the comment on the overall request from the sheriff's office, and it wasn't reconciling with what I was showing, so I was trying to figure out where I might have missed something on which funds. You're saying that your department proposed actually had a decrease in the amount of money that you were asking for from the general fund. And I think part of the challenge that I had, I showed after I did my reconciliation, roughly $1.5 million additional in general fund that the sheriff's office was requesting from this year's budget. And so I'm wondering, it would be helpful for me to see where you're reconciling, and I think it speaks to some of the challenges on which, if you're using discretionary or designated funds for that purpose, just so I can reconcile from where I'm at, because that's not what was reflected in the budget submissions that I reviewed.
Of course.
It's hard being short. So our total funds that we have that equate to 15.2 million is all of our funds that we have that we're asking for expenditure allocations for. We're asking for $6.6 million in the general fund, $1.2 million for the marijuana funds. The two together come to 7.8. Then there's trial court at 665, which is a designated fund. There's $332,000 of expenditures that would come from AB 443. There is $161,000 required for dispatch to cover costs, that is. There is $1.5 million that are required, some of which come from grants. So this is for our total budget picture. Is that what you're referring to?
That's
CO less?
getting to what I was looking at, and I guess I showed that basically when you look at the net general fund request after you take total expenditures less your revenues of 10.43 million, and that's why I was trying to reconcile with where you were noting, just so I could figure out where the variance is, because again, maybe the error is on some sheets that I had or what's in the budget system, which is still what I'm trying to trace through on the little hiccups and bugs within our, what gets submitted, what got rolled into the sheets that I use to build the budget with.
Okay. With respect to the general funds only?
Yes.
Okay, general funds is $6 million for patrol, $1.1 million for dispatch, or 1.2 almost. CNU, $137,000. Marine safety, you have a contribution of $98,000 and change. The jail, $3.9 million and change. And we forfeited the OES funds. So that comes to 11.3 million, sir?
Yes, okay, now that reconciles with what I was looking for in the general fund, because I showed that as an increase over last year's requests, not a decrease in what was submitted. That was where I was confused
Okay.
from the presentation.
Okay.
Presentation involves the total of all funds.
Okay, so just designated funds that you were pulling in additional revenue for that were outside of general fund.
If you're referencing the slide, yes.
Yes.
Okay,
the
yes,
15.2.
that was the slide that I was referencing.
It says total all funds.
All funds.
Okay.
I'm sorry that was confusing for us.
That was it, thank you.
That was it?
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of the sheriff or the captain by the board? Supervisor Mills?
Yes. When you're looking at the position control list, and not so much the one that you gave us, but I'm thinking along the lines of, we have positions that are funded and then possibly not filled. We don't know what length of time. So if a position is not filled for 30 days and it's say a $100,000 position with salary and benefits, that's 30 days worth of salary savings, it happens. And then you kind of accumulate that over time where you have any open positions. To what amount of money are we talking about? Should we be more looking about just in time budgeting for positions? If you know that, for instance, someone's in the academy, you're going through the process, you don't need that position fully funded until that person is functional in your department. So, trying to figure out how that funding stream could be better utilized might be one of the ways to get it done without creating an unnecessary burden for your department. I'm thinking also about cost of turnover, not only to your department, but to the HR and to the rest of the system. And if there was a way that we could work to assist in getting that turnover lowered, that would also provide some additional salary savings, because HR or somebody else is doing that work, and you're doing the work too to bring them into your department. So there's an expense involved there. And I agree. I think marijuana needs to be a line item. It just needs to be. We would do that with any other identified situation, and I don't think there should be any different. So I would like to dig into the position control list a lot more deeply to better understand how we can utilize the cash that you need and possibly even reserve cash to be sure that when you have a position that you need to fill, that we have the money available to fill it. And not so much to think of it in terms of the budget for the entire year, but for the budget as it progresses and that position needs to be filled. I don't want to make it too confusing, but I think there's a possibility of us, if we better utilize that funding source to the direct need instead of leaving it as an open position funded, we could then use that money in other ways to assist getting other things done.
Well, you can in some aspect, but you have to remember, out of 4 of these positions, and technically 5 of these positions, you have 5 recruits in the academy. They're being paid right now. So the fact that they're in there, there's some monies that are going to be coming out of those positions. They're in a limited term position right now, and we had talked about that. I think Ms. Hawkins had talked about that before. Those limited term positions, extra hires, which they're classified as, do not have a position control number assigned to them. But we have that number set aside, and those are where those funds are going to be coming from when they hit the streets. So you're going to have some savings, because obviously they're not, their salaries are different as a limited term as opposed to being a deputy. So you're going to have some savings there. But some of the positions that we're talking about freezing, again, one's a grant fund, and 3 of them at this point are marijuana funds. So you can't assume those positions at all, because they're grant-funded positions. They're not general fund positions.
Sheriff, please understand, I'm not even really thinking about those specific positions. I'm thinking of this in a larger scheme of things.
Right.
Because when you lose a staff member, let's say, for instance, they're a retiree, all of a sudden that unfunded liability, those PERS and those OPEBs hit you. And that becomes a cost that you didn't have. It's in the books, but it's not a cost until they leave.
Right.
So we have to be able to calculate all of those variables and be able to plug them in and say, are we best utilizing the funding stream at the moment we need those funds to fill that position? And I'm not advocating at all cutting any positions. What I'm advocating is trying to find a way to make better use of our funding streams to meet the needs that you need it when you need it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But I think it needs to be a side conversation and in a larger perspective to just specifically your department. I think it will bleed over to other departments as we start to work through that process.
We would be in strong support of being able to utilize our salary savings at a later date if it were to be placed into a fund, if that's what you're suggesting. Just keep in mind, excuse me, some of our positions are like a guy in a factory. When he leaves, somebody has to show up, just some of them. So if we have a vacancy, then we have to fill that with overtime, and that's where a lot of our salary savings goes on certain positions. But we would be in total support of some sort of fund that we would see a benefit back to the department if we were able to realize some savings, regardless of what that's through.
And I fully agree with you. To me, there's good overtime and bad overtime.
Correct.
There is no such thing as an in-between, because once you start to get into bad overtime, now you start to fall into risk problems and you start to fall into employee performance problems. But there is a limit to which people can work within a particular position and not fall into that bad overtime situation. I'm very concerned and maybe thinking about the risks that might be there as a result of the excessive overtime that could be better balanced. So there becomes a cost. As what point do you reach to say, we can't afford this overtime anymore, we've got to put a position in here to make it up? Because when you put the position in, now you're going to need another vehicle. You're going to need everything else that goes with that position. So it's not just a simple decision, but I think that the overall dollar figures have to be calculated in such a way that everybody clearly understands that we need to be just in time so that you get the money when you need it to fill the position you need to fill, and that we're not squabbling over how to get that done.
The other thing you talked about was the turnover of deputies, turnover of staff in general. That is something that we've been combating for years, and we've all talked about that. The cost, you talked about, I don't remember who it was that was talking about in fact, Mr. Segali was talking about costs of comparable counties. We are compared to 6 counties, and we're at the bottom of the totem pole, and these guys know that, so they're leaving because of that. It's not always the reason. Money is not always the reason, but it is a driving factor for a lot of these folks to be leaving, is that they're not making as much money. Like I said once before in this room right here, when I was a sergeant, I could have went to Amador County, made $10 an hour more. Why would somebody not leave to go there? I like it here. I grew up in this county. I have more of a commitment to this county, whereas these people that we're hiring that come from out of the area, they don't have that commitment. So that's where your turnover is coming from. I want to say we're at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to hiring people, but we don't get the people that are, and the millennial thing is a huge thing too. We're not getting, it's not that we're not getting good people. The people we have on the streets are absolutely fantastic, but their mindset is, I want to make more money, because if I make more money now, my retirement looks better when I retire.
Mr. Mills, if I could just
Yes,
add
thank
something. Your point is, I understand your point clearly, and we need to have float positions so that when we are full, now that we have strong information of our known vacancy rate, we actually need more positions than we have to adjust for that float.
True.
And we're not doing that. We're going a different direction, and that's why we're so concerned about the current proposal, because we're under where we need to be. And if we stop this machine, not only are we not going to get caught back up, but we're not going to have the float we now know we need to have each and every year until we get this thing balanced out.
Yeah, I don't want to, devolve this into this is a very broad conversation right now. I think it needs to be a separate conversation all by itself as to how we resolve this and how we work it out. But I think it's valuable to have this as part of the budget process. Remember, this is a preliminary budget, it's not the final. So this is the beginning point. So let's just consider it that, and let's go forward from there as to how we're going to fix it.
The last thing I want to reiterate in this is that if for some reason you do decide to freeze these positions in the sheriff's office, we showed the time frame that it takes to rehire people. Remember how many people are leaving the department. On an annual basis, we have quite a few people that have been leaving, and those are statistics. Those aren't numbers that we pulled out of a hat. Those are statistical numbers that are on paper. So if you stop that process, I gotta go back to my car issue. We didn't buy cars for 5 years, and here we are with cars with 249,000 miles on them. If you don't stay ahead of the game, you're going to get behind the game, and I can't afford for our citizens to be behind the game with cops on the street, because our job is to protect our citizens, and if we don't have the cops on the street, if we don't have the probation officers, if we don't have the DAs to prosecute, again, I'm back to that big revolving circle. We need all of those in law enforcement to make this program work, to keep our constituents safe.
You made a good point, and that is the capital improvement program should probably have been instituted, give you a 5-year CIP that you can start matching up funding, start allocating or amortizing your capital needs well in advance of the need itself, so that you don't run into this I need it now kind of situation we've been going through for years, and then all of a sudden somebody says we don't have the money, so they walk away.
I completely
Let's not
agree.
even go there. Let's get that 5-year CIP and some kind of an action plan put together so we all agree to where we're going to go with it and what steps we're going to take.
I gave you my 5-year plan. Let's work on it.
Yes, you did.
All right, gentlemen.
Anything
Great.
else?
We agreed on something.
There we go. Any other questions for us?
Supervisor Garamendi.
Hey, Sheriff. Quick question, and I'm going to pull the card that I'm brand new to the board. This is a very complex document. I'm probably going to ask a lot of stupid questions over the
If you
next
don't
couple
know
of
the
days.
answer, it's not a stupid question.
Well, go with me here. I'm looking at you guys' budget, and I see a $1.175 million transfer from MCCRP cannabis funds, and then that 1.175 trails through all your line item expenses. My concern is when the majority of the board is, and this budget is built upon not having cannabis dollars. So where are these dollars, if we move forward with the ban, where is this 1.175 that's built into your budget? Is that just going to disappear?
Yeah, if the marijuana program goes away, unless you 5 gentlemen on the board come up with that money to continue with that program ends.
Okay, because I thought, and maybe this is a question for Tim, I thought we were building our budget without cannabis dollars.
To be clear, what we did is budget with the remaining, these are the fees that were collected through the urgency ordinance to basically the remainder use up of the rest of those funds that we collected. The assumption is no new funds collected through any regulatory fee. We still do have the overall issue, as the auditor has pointed out, and as we look to see what finally comes in year end for requests against the amount, that 3.7 that was collected, to see what's truly left over, to know, do we have a shortage or not? We have a number of these positions, as we noted in the special session, that are still vacant, that allows us flexibility to say we can't fill them and apply them to that program. But that's what, when any of the departments put in that request, it was only for the remainder of those funds.
So this is prorated based upon what we think we'll expend this year and what's going to be remaining in the budget, and assuming that the board continues on the direction of ban, and that's the cutoff date. So these numbers aren't stretched out throughout the year, they're front-loaded, I'm guessing.
Well, I think that's kind of up to how the department did it. They were not given specific directions on front-load it. I know that we've been trying to, for instance, there's a lot of front-load costs now to get through all the rest of the registrations, and then now that we're getting to 8.06, the abatement costs, I think we're going to see that will chew through the remaining dollar funds pretty quickly. And in the absence of any alternative, like i.e. a regulatory ordinance, then yes, we would have to look at all of those positions and decide, does the remainder of that year get funded general fund, or do those positions then terminate at that point when the funds are gone?
Right. I just don't want this to be a very expensive summer for the sheriff and his deputies. I just don't want you guys to have this budgeted in next year's budget and you're another $1.1 million in the hole, just to stay even.
Well, like I said, a lot of it is going to depend on what you folks do if we do end up with a ban, on what direction you go. Like CAO said, those funds are there, and I know Rebecca Callan had said at one point it's going to take, with all the departments together, you're looking at $2.2 or $2.3 million, or whatever the case may be, and we only have 1 point something in there.
Right, I'm
So
thinking.
there's a shortfall there, but again, there are 26 positions associated to that, but yet only 20 of them are filled. So there's a little bit of a savings there, like
Right.
the CEO just said, but the bottom line is, as we progress throughout the year, how much of those funds are going to get used up, and at what time frame. And
Right.
at the end, when that last dollar gets spent, that's
That's your whole, because this is for 17-18 budget,
correct.
and we're going to burn through most of this before the end of this fiscal year, I'm betting.
If I have my way about it, and 806 the way it's going, absolutely, we're
Or I
going to
would
be busy.
encourage that, that'd be great.
Yeah.
But that's going to leave you a big hole in the middle of your budget for 17-18.
On the marijuana side, yes.
Right, I mean, but it's
Absolutely.
built into your operating
Yeah,
budget.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
There is, and like Captain said, it does leave a big hole because of the criminal side that we're going to continue to deal with after the fact.
Right, I just want to make sure
Yeah.
we've got true numbers
Yeah.
as far as what the actual cut is to you.
Okay. Anything else?
I just have one question. Tofinelli?
Yeah, I just have one question. When are the three deputies due out of the academy? To be,
Again, there's 3 there now. I'm hoping to have 2 more, and they would graduate. Can you help me out to remember? Well, they
3-4 weeks.
yeah. So you're looking at 5 months from now.
5 months from
Yeah,
now?
yeah.
Okay. All right.
Sheriff, I have a question. You plan on getting 2 more, or what are you going to do? Steal them from the academy down there?
Well, actually, yesterday I was at the academy, and there are a lot of gentlemen that are there and ladies that are putting themselves through the academy. So I went
Okay.
down and did a recruiting to try and get them to hire on with us.
Okay.
So the cost for those would obviously be a lot less because they're already in the process.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm hoping to steal a couple out of the academy.
Kind of figured you would.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sheriff. Any other further questions regarding the sheriff's presentation from the board?
Great conversation.
Can I ask 2 questions real quick of the CAO? On the presentation during the pie chart, you had a public safety percentage of of cost impacts? I wanted to know which departments were included in that public safety section.
That was shown on an earlier slide. If you look, and again, the slide's on the CAO's budget website. It lists it, but it was basically, it had probation, district attorney, sheriff, and all of the, since, as you know, you have a number of funds or department programs underneath it, and also the coroner was included in that.
So was it just those departments, or were there any other county departments listed under that public safety section?
No, none that I recall, but like I said, that I can pull it up and name them off right now if you'd like me to. You can also go back and verify from the...
When I read the original letter, it wasn't clear to me, the memo rather, but maybe I missed it. And then the second question I had, if somebody could answer, how much money came into Teeter in 16-17?
Looks like the auditor's coming behind you, and I can answer your first question now, or maybe Rebecca wants to answer that now since you got up.
Teeter's revenue is kind of odd. So what happens is we process all of the activity for the entire year. And then when we go to close out the year, we figure out how much is in the tax loss reserve fund. And then we do the transfer into the Teeter designated fund. So it's been averaging 1 point, so we haven't posted it yet is my point, but we've been averaging, if I look at the past trends, it's about 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 million, somewhere around there annually.
Does that answer your question, Sheriff? I'm sorry, Captain?
Yes.
And then in answer to yours, the funds that are listed under public safety, and again, this is alphabetical, AB 443 operating, booking fees operating, Cal NARC enforcement unit, Cal EMA operating, coroner, day reporting center, dispatch, district attorney, DUI vertical prosecution, jail, marine safety, office of emergency services, probation, public administrator, public defender, sheriff, the SLE, SF jail, sheriff, trial, court security, victim witness assistance, and XC victim services.
Thank you. And the reason why I wanted to ask is because when the general public or when the board hears that the public safety expenditure is that massive amount, they tend to think it all goes to the sheriff's office. And maybe some that are more educated think, well, it probably goes to the DA and probation too. They don't realize just how watered down that fund is significantly going to entities such as the public defender. The general public doesn't really understand the public defender falls under public safety or the public administrator's office. So I think that would be important for the board to know. And then lastly, with respect to the Teeter fund, the reason I asked that question, and I had no clue how much money was going in there, is I often hear that fund is referred to as one-time money. And I'll let somebody who has more experience with the Teeter fund determine whether it is one-time funding or not. But it sounds like that there is some money that goes into there on a semi-regular basis and what have you. Because as I've sat and listened and try and place myself into the seats of board members, and many of which come and go, there's terms such as Teeter and one-time that would lead one to believe it's one-time funding. And then you have contingencies and reserves, which are different funds. So I just wanted some clarification for myself as well as others. Thank you.
Thank you. I see no lights on. Thank you very much, Sheriff. Thank you, Captain. At this time, we'll hear from the District Attorney. Ms. Yook. Ms. Yook, are you going to require setup for any type of PowerPoint? You can take your 5 minutes? Let's take a 5-minute break, folks.
I'll wait for you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back in session. Point of order, sir. I'll hear your point of order. Come to the microphone, please.
Sorry for an interruption, but we were told in the beginning that we would have the opportunity for a public comment as each individual department moved forward.
Where'd you hear that, sir? From
you
me?
guys. We may address each one as they move forwards. Reserve your certain comments till each department comes forward and talks to their points.
Yeah, that was after all presentations by the departments. That was the intent of that statement, sir.
Okay, so I misunderstood.
All right.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hear from District Attorney York, and that'll conclude today's session. We will resume tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the chambers. Okay.
Good afternoon, Barbara Uke, District Attorney. I do have a brief PowerPoint presentation for you. This was an evolving presentation. I had intended to spend the majority of the time on some follow-up from the study session and some information that was requested. And then I had intended to spend the majority of the time on my specific budget requests. But when the budget packet and recommendation came out last Thursday, I had to switch gears yet again. So I apologize if it does seem disjointed. I did try to put it together as best I could with those three goals in mind. The first thing, you've seen this, you've seen it in the tables, you saw it in the CAO's overview, but it was really small. So I just want to make sure that I highlight this number for you. The CAO is recommending that $483,965 be cut out of the district attorney's budget. That is a huge hit. That was a surprise to us. I was not aware that was coming, but the CAO graciously fit us into his schedule so that we could find out where this number was coming from, where did he identify this as a potential cut to my budget. What we received was the drill down on the specific positions, and so this was cut and pasted from an Excel spreadsheet that's quite lengthy, so it doesn't have all of the details, but it does have the positions that were identified. These were provided to my office by the CAO's office for where the $483,965 comes from. And this does address what Mr. Mills had brought up earlier about seeing the position numbers and the actual positions that are tied to the potential cuts. So this is still a little bit small, so I'll list them off for you. One is the position that was related to our DUI program. That was a program assistant. That was a limited term position. We no longer have funding for that particular program. That was a CalOES grant. There are 2 deputy district attorney positions, a paralegal, a clerical assistant, a victim witness advocate, and another victim witness advocate. So those are the positions that, when you look at the total budget employee cost, come out to the nearly $500,000 that is being proposed to be cut out of my budget. What I did is I worked with my staff on identifying if there are people in these positions, are these open positions, or what status are these positions. That was very important to my office, clearly. And what we determined was that the first position, the program assistant, that position hasn't been filled in a couple of years. It is not a position that we budgeted for. It is nothing that we are recruiting for. So that's fine. That was a relief. Okay, so the next position that was of a concern to us is the Deputy District Attorney 2 position. Looking at the budget unit, that is what I believe is actually a grant-funded position that was supported by the Sheriff's Office. That is, I believe, the ADA JAG grant that is going away. We still receive funding for part of a Deputy District Attorney through the end of December. So either that is a portion that was tied to a previous employee that had that funding, or there's someone sitting in it. So, I haven't quite determined that to try to link up the numbers, but I believe that is actually a portion of a deputy DA who was funded by the grant in previous years through the Sheriff's Office. These 3 positions right here are victim witness. Those are Department 21. Those are 100% grant funded. I would definitely be opposed to cutting those positions. 2 of them are filled. We have people sitting in them, and they are, like I said, grant funded positions. So that does not affect the general fund. No general funds are used in those 3 positions for sure, and probably no general funds were ever used for any of those 5 positions that are on this chart. So if we take those away, the 2 positions that we are most concerned about are the top position, the Deputy District Attorney. That position, we do have an offer out. We had an employee go on to greener pastures, I believe Napa County a couple of months ago. We've gone through the hiring process, the interview process. This person is in background right now. I certainly would hate to have to call them and say, oh, you know, there's hiring freeze and you can't come on board. Not to mention the impact to that person. We're an attorney short, and we've been an attorney short for a couple of months right now, and this would be devastating to our operations. So for that particular position, this person is already in background. I would strongly object to that position being cut. I do not think that it should be subject to a hiring freeze. As I said, this person, we already have an offer out, and this position is currently in background. The other position that is left on this board is the paralegal criminal. Now, this is the shared position between my office and code compliance. Animal services used to have a portion of this position. It was 40%, and 20%, 2 days a week, and 1 day a week. Animal services did not seek to continue on with the position, so they've done something else where they're funding. I don't know what, but I'm sure they're putting it to good use. I'm not making comment on that. This position right now is just a part-time position. It's a 0.6 employee. I've got 2 days a week, and code compliance has 1 day a week. The recruitment for this closes on 6/23, I think that's what that says. You know, we don't have an offer out. The person's not in background, but this is an important position. It's an important position between my office and code compliance. Historically, for the time that we had the position, we both received a semiotic impact and a greater impact than just a part-time employee, I would say, because of the crossover nature of the assignment. And I believe that code compliance's portion of these funds is not general funds, but I don't know that for sure. I'm not really sure how they fund their 1 day a week of this position. You know, perhaps the building official could answer that question. I believe it's non-general fund, so when you take off what is the potentially a non-general fund portion, the general fund savings for wiping out this position for my office would be $40,000. Then we talk about the extra hires. I know that the CAO had expressed that there wasn't going to be a hard and fast rule on all extra hires. There might be some room for talking about the extra hires if there was perhaps an overtime implication, if it was going to cost more, or maybe if you had other funds for your extra hires. I utilize the extra hires in my office as needed when we are in desperate need of extra help. For instance, right now I've got someone out on disability, and without extra hire help, it would cause us to be incredibly inefficient with our time and our resources. You know, it's an extra hire clerical, which is no disrespect for the person who's doing this job and doing it very well. It's a very lowly paid position. You know, I have to staff the courts. I have to provide legal representation to the people in criminal cases. So I have to have attorneys. I can't send extra hire clerical to court. So if we can't have the extra hires, what's going to happen is I'm going to have attorneys pulling files. Now, attorneys can pull files, and attorneys can make copies, and attorneys can answer the door, but that is not the best use of our resources. So when we do use extra hires, it's for a very good reason, and you know, I would object to just the straight up black and white getting rid of all extra hires, or putting us through some hoops, some extra hoops, to justify why it's okay for us to spend salary savings for another highly paid employee on entry-level clerical. So I would urge you to consider that and carve out maybe some you know, more hard and fast exceptions so that we don't have to go through some of these hoops that could happen with what's being proposed. Instead of just listing out the positions and giving you numbers, this is our current staffing level. The two positions in red, the deputy DA and the .4 paralegal, those are the positions that are being proposed to be cut. As I said, the one is currently in background, and the other is, I think, a very key position for interdepartmental efficiencies. You can see we have deputy DAs, and we have our support staff, and we have an administrative assistant. We have one investigator, one sworn position, and we have the non-sworn investigator, that is the investigative assistant. That is what we look like right now, with the exception of this arm that we have built I don't even know what the percentage would be, over the last year from 1 person to 6 people. Our Victim Services Division, we are very proud of the Victim Services Division and what they've already accomplished and what we're looking forward to them accomplishing. I have the program coordinator for our base Victim Services Division, that's Department 21, and our victim advocate for our XC grant, who you met a couple of weeks ago. They are here if you had specific questions about their budget units. That is in purple because that is all grant funding. Out of the 20 employees for the DA's office, 6 are grant funded. I didn't parse out the other bits and pieces of grant funding we do receive, but the assistant DA, the admin assistant, the investigator, and one of my deputy DAs are actually funded by non-general fund sources in a small way. It's like 5% here, 5% there, 1% there. I didn't include that, but if you drill down and do the math, we're over 30% non-general fund at this point. And we're very grateful for the partnerships that we've built and very grateful for the grant funding. So that's what we look like right now. My budget request, specifically and probably the main, one of the main things that I'm hoping that you will consider is funding a DAI mid-year. My one and only DAI has been putting off retirement for about 4 years, and he's told me he's not willing to put it off any longer, no matter how much I beg, because he is maxed out. And we don't have an exact date yet, but it will be during the next fiscal year. And for succession planning, I do need to bring in another DAI. Now, you heard how long it takes to recruit a sheriff's deputy. We have the same issues. We have the same recruitment and retention issues. So my request is that the DAI position be established now and be funded later on down the road. And this sort of addresses the concern that Supervisor Mills brought up, that you don't want to fund it now because we can't spend it now. So I want to be realistic about it. 6 months is very optimistic. It's not likely we would have someone in place in 6 months, but you put it out too long and you lose interest. So my request is that we establish the position now for a DAI 1, allow me to start a recruitment and put on the flyer that the job starts in January. And we don't fund it for that first half of the year. That's unrealistic. We won't have someone in place. I think that 6 months is very optimistic. I don't know that would happen in less than a year, but we have to start now. We have to start now. Before the recession, we used to have 3. We used to have 3 sworn officers in my office. And these are the officers that have had experience with crime scenes. Perhaps they've been detective for a number of years. They typically have a number of years on patrol and then moved on to a detective position, which gives them that crime scene experience. That's a lot to ask for. That's a lot to ask for what we pay. And it's a lot to ask for to move laterally from one agency to another where they don't have some of the perks, if you will, that sometimes other law enforcement agencies offer. We don't have a take-home car. We don't have overtime. It's riding a desk instead of a patrol car. It's sitting in court. It's doing everything that we need to do, including providing for my office's safety. So we used to have 3, and that's fallen to 1 for the last few years. I think it's been since 2010. When we lost our other 2 DAIs. We do have the 1 non-sworn investigative assistant as of this year. I think she started in April, so that's a new service that we have, and she's helping out immensely with some of the investigations and investigative activities that it does not take the gun and the badge to do. But I do have a need for additional sworn officers who can help our law enforcement partners with search warrants, can do assistance at crime scenes, can do the heavy lifting that needs to be done after the case is filed, and again also provide for our safety. So we used to have 3. My request again is to begin recruiting now, fund mid-year start date, February, March, whichever, as long as we can get started. I want to be realistic about it. And a mid-year start date right now, the funding is $62,653. It's a big ticket item because it's a sworn peace officer, and they do cost more because of what they have to do to get to where they are and the requirements to maintain their sworn position. Following up from the study session, I want to repeat, we have had 31 criminal cases filed from the marijuana enforcement team. That is just the cultivation cases. That does not include other matters that I would say are related to marijuana, such as the robberies, the assaults with a deadly weapon, the brandishing of a weapon, and some of the other litany of crimes that we have seen that I would say are directly related to marijuana and the changes we've seen in our community with marijuana. You know, that's a hot button issue, and you know, I don't want to be attacked to parse out individual cases. You know, when you look at what's charged, that's easy to see. But at 211, you don't charge motive. But if the motive is to rip off a grow, clearly that's marijuana related. So I don't think without stretching it, we have a lot of marijuana crimes. Certainly you could drill down and debate each individual case, but this number does not include the increases in other crimes that we have seen. We have crimes against people who are here only to grow. They tell the officers that. We're here, why are you here? Oh, I live over here, you know, I'm just staying over here, and I'm here to grow, or I'm here to trim, or I was sent by a trim broker. We have those types of cases. And so you don't see that reflected in the charge, but we see it reflected in our cases. And it's kind of interesting. One impact that we didn't necessarily expect to see, but we see over and over again, is that because of the transient nature of the population, when cases come forward 2 or 3 months down the road, we can't find these people. They don't want to be found. They're not from here, and it's very difficult. We had a very serious case where, well, the worker is now living out of state, and they wanted us to pay for them to come back. So that's another hit to my budget, and I've got to balance out. Do I pay to have this uncooperative witness come back, or do I let this robber walk? You know, those are the decisions that we're having to face because of these changes in the population. And I'm not passing judgment on if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but these are costs that we are seeing. We have the 38 just urgency ordinance cases pending. We have the 28 cases that referred to the circuit prosecutor. That is the deputy DA who I have deputized out of Sacramento to help us on the environmental cases because of her expertise and her assignment that cost no cost to the county. These consisted primarily of the CAL FIRE timber harvest cases, taking timber without the correct permitting for commercial purpose. It's a very specific charge. 6 have settled civilly. 25 of the 28 had filed applications with the county. So I suspect what happened was that maybe CAL FIRE was out on the inspections and found these violations. The circuit prosecutor resources, I just wanted to clarify this, was at least 180 hours of attorney time that was spent on these cases. And this was the free resource from CDAA. So the county did not have to absorb any of this cost, and it was not a cost to my office. And I certainly didn't have an extra 180 hours of attorney time to spend. It was also over 40 hours of paralegal time, and that was the project paralegal, the CDAA paralegal's time that she spent assisting the attorney in these cases. Again, that was not absorbed by my office, and we did not pay for it. Okay, some more follow-up. I believe this was Supervisor Oliveira's question about where do fines and fees go. Okay, so I apologize. I did not have time to really drill down on all of the ins and outs of where the court fines go, but under 76,000 of the government code, subdivision A, $7 for every $10 of fine is collected. There's another subdivision E that says that $7 is actually reduced by $3, and in lieu of that $3 is added to the court construction fund. Under PC 1464, $10 for every $10 of fine is added. The 76,000 obligation is taken off the top. 70% goes to the state and 30% goes to the county. Now, some of these funds are determined by Board of Supervisors resolution as to where these monies go. I did not have an opportunity to track down all of that. You know, if you were interested in finding out more about where all of these fines and fees go, the first thing I would do is ask the auditor, because I think the money ends up with the auditor's office, and I'm sure she takes very good care of it and sends it where it needs to go. I wanted to provide you with an example of the penalty distribution, and I apologize, this is very hard to see. I got this off the court website. This deals with some fish and game charges, And in the middle, right there, I did the green circle, is the county penalty assessment, and that is built on the $10 assessment that goes to a charge. I picked this page because in the middle right there has 2 charges related to water pollution, misdemeanors under the Fish and Game Code that would be relevant to the study session perhaps, because these are charges that, if investigated, could come forward as separate charges. For instance, 5650 is a depositing or permitting to pass into waters deleterious matters. And the section below that is 5652, littering within 150 feet of a water. And clearly our waterways are something that it behooves us all to protect and we should all be concerned about. So if you look over the first little column has the base amount, the state penalty, and there is the county portion. For instance, for that particular charge, the county penalty assessment would be $150 for the first charge of depositing the deleterious matter into waters, and then the littering would be $30. So that's how that links up. So that's just one example. But I feel confident that if you wanted more and you wanted more drilled on each of the line items isn't the right word, but I don't want to confuse budget, but each of the segments and where that money goes, I would imagine the court or the auditor's office could help you out, and they certainly would be my first call to try to give you more accurate information on that. The extra penalty for production and cultivation of a controlled substance attaches to certain crimes. This is under Fish and Game Code 12025. And this is what we can use to enhance civil penalties for certain types of offenses under the Fish and Game Code. We have to have a structure to do that. We have to have infrastructure to do that. We have to have the right people in the right places and the right sort of investigations and the right staffing to carry through with these. But these tools already exist. they are on the books. And this is a little bit easier to read. But if you had, for instance, water pollution of state waters and it was a trespass grow related, not only do you have the fines and fees and penalties that would attach to the charge in a civil prosecution, you could also have the additional $40,000 penalty under 12025. So that's how this works. The middle column would be the amount of extra penalty that would attach if it was a trespass grow. And the last column would be the amount of penalty. And it's a lesser amount when it's the owner or lessee doing it to their own property, which makes sense. I think that makes sense. So you have things like littering near a stream, illegal dumping of hazardous substances, the timber harvest cases, those are on there, and cutting the timber for commercial purpose without the plan. Now, when we do get these extra penalties under the 12025, these are distributed pursuant to statute. 30% will go to the county after costs to my office of any investigation or prosecution. 30% goes to the investigating agency for costs for their investigations, and 40% to the timber regulations and forest restoration fund. They provide grants for restoration for damage done by pot. Okay. So this dovetails into my other main budget request, and this is a request that I've been making for a year, and so I'm getting a little tired of hearing myself talk about it, but some of you are new, so we'll go for it. This is for a cannabis industry crimes unit. Call it whatever we want to call it. I do think that it could fit well into a consumer protection type unit. If we can broaden it to specifically consumer protection, we may be eligible for some potential grant funding or some other utilization of funds. I haven't gotten that far with it yet because, frankly, that's not something that would happen overnight. It needs to come from you first. It is a large amount of money. I don't know that I have an actual dollar figure for you because the big part of it is the forensic accountant position, which does not exist in the county. It would have to be created, which obviously is going to take some time. So this is a 4-member unit. It is made up of a DDA. It would have to be a high-level DDA because of the types of cases. Another investigator. This is the sworn peace officer that can assist in the investigations because these are broad-based investigations and requires the ability to write search warrants, the forensic accountant, and a paralegal. So all 3 of those positions currently exist, and we know how much they do cost. The forensic accountant, however, we do not, again. The unit would partner with the CCSO, and this is required surely because of facilities. You know, the sheriff has generously offered that the team could be housed in the sheriff's office, and that makes sense as well. It's a facilities issue, plus it makes sense work-wise to be partnered and embedded with the marijuana enforcement team, so the whole unit can work as a whole unit and go after cases, not just with one piece in mind, but with all of the tools that are available to them under the law right now. It's a mixed criminal and civil caseload, so we have certain crimes that we can go after, but certain conduct can also be pursued civilly. And sometimes civil makes more sense, sometimes criminal makes more sense. So we do have to have someone who would be able to do civil cases and the criminal cases. Now, you're probably more familiar with the administrative cases. Those are the ones that you see. We're not talking about the administrative cases, we're talking about civil cases in court. Cases such as environmental crimes, environmental civil actions, tax evasion, the B&P 17200, that is the unfair businesses practices cases. You could, under the authority of the district attorney's office, the 17200 could go as an injunction, which has certain penalties, $2,500 per violation. And once an injunction's in place, if there's a violation of the injunction, it's $6,000, and it's an ongoing, that could be per day. So it's one small area under the BNP where unfair practices could make an impact. Unfair business practices actions could make a big impact. Workers' comp, water pollution, pesticides, and asset forfeiture. Now, asset forfeiture is limited, and it's limited with marijuana crimes. It's broader with other types of crimes, but it still exists with marijuana. And just the breakdown for you for what happens with assets that are seized and ordered forfeited by the court, or administratively. We actually do have an administrative procedure that we can use, but a larger case does have to go through court process. Once all is said and done, and the court does order whatever assets were seized, and say it's a bank account, say it's cash, or say it's property that is auctioned off, those proceeds, they're all put together. When all is said and done, the costs are taken off the top of the forfeiture of the forfeiture action. It would be publication, maybe it's an auction house, maybe it's storage. Those hard costs are taken off the top, and the rest is ordered distributed. 24% goes to the state, 65% goes to the law enforcement agency who did the investigation. And say it's the sheriff's office, it would go to the sheriff's office. Say it was a partnership with the sheriff's office and Angels Camp and CHP. The funds would be apportioned out according to how much they had of the investigation. Of the 65%, 15% of that has to go in a special fund to address and try to work on some prevention efforts with, loosely termed, kids, gangs, and drugs. Okay, so you have the 24% off to state, 65% to law enforcement, 15% of that 65% goes to a special fund for kids, gangs, and drugs, 10% goes to my office, and 1% goes to CDAA, who provides the statutorily required training for asset forfeiture, because it has to be done right. It can't be done to make revenue. It can't be done to fund position. It's meant to enhance law enforcement and to get the bad guys. What we find is that people who are involved in drugs and drug trafficking historically, they don't really care about jail time. They care about their money. They care about their cars. They care about things like that. So that it was meant as a tool, a punishment tool. It's not meant as a revenue source. That being said, it does potentially provide money for the county. And I said that last time I was with you, that I would talk about how some of this can be revenue, but you know, we're not pirates, and we don't talk about, and we don't do these things in order to make money. The DA's office is not a money maker. We seek justice, we're not seeking revenue, and that's just how it is. And once again, like I said last year, I think it's important to do this now so that we can be up and running in a year. So say you decided to go down this road with me, it'll probably be at least a year before we have the staffing in place. So that's just the reality of it. So I'm hopeful that repeating myself might might get some traction here. Okay, the last part of my budget memo, I did want to address this, is a facilities issue. I'm very pleased to report that one area of big concern that we had was for our victim services division. Finding a home for them fell by the wayside with the last CIO leaving apparently, and we were feeling in very desperate straits. My victim services had to move into our investigations trailer, which unfortunately was right next to the day reporting center, not a good location. IT was going to have to dig a trench to put in more network cable, but we just received word last week that CalOES has approved use of the grant funds to enter into a leased option. It is off campus. We are in the process of preparing a separate budget, a separate board item to talk about that potential location, and so that will be a separate agenda item. We're very, very pleased. It does look like, as long as you agree, that victim services will have a proper home. So that is the good news. That is the good news about the victim services division. Now, my request for the facilities is that the main office be addressed. My office is a 4-wide. It was temporary housing 13 years ago, and having to jack us up is what they call it. I'm not trying to be flippant or anything. They have to crawl underneath and actually jack us up periodically. It's not a good situation, and I would like to have all of you hear it all at the same time that I do wish to try to find some way to get my office into a more appropriate housing situation. I have not looked into potential funding sources for this. I have only just begun trying to track down what funding there could possibly be. There is something called the Judicial Construction Fund. I believe it has $1.2 million in it. I'm still trying to track that down. I don't know if that's the dollar amount. I don't know what strings are attached to it. I think it came from historically something when before the state took over the court completely, when the court was still here, and there was funding going into that. I'm just throwing it out there, and maybe someone can answer the question for me whether or not that is even a possibility. There's also the Criminal Justice Facilities Fund, which I believe is a separate fund, and I believe that's the one that the court fees drop into. Is there funding in the CIP? Is there other existing space on campus? I certainly don't want to put another department into a worse situation, but I know that the CIO is very interested in looking at a new master space plan for the government center, for the county offices, and figuring out how can we best address everybody's needs, not necessarily make everybody happy, but at least try to work on some more permanent solutions. And so I did let him know that when there is a committee, I would like to be a part of that. And 3 of you, I think, have been to my office. I don't believe the other 2 have, but I invite you. And the CIO has not been to my office. I almost put a picture, but it was a little embarrassing. So, but I definitely invite you down. I know you weren't in trouble. You came to visit. Just want to clarify that for everybody. So it's not just our main office. It's our investigations trailer. It's up a ramp. The ramp is falling apart. It's right next to the day reporting center. It's not a good location. So I'm hopeful that you will consider that request as somewhat of a high priority, and perhaps look into some of these funds and see if there's any possibility that any of these funds could be used to try to get us into a more appropriate office. I do have, as I mentioned to you, the 2 staff members who run the 2 victim services grants here, in case you had any questions for them. Any questions?
Does that conclude your presentation?
I'm sorry.
You're still on your presentation, right?
I'm still what?
You're still on your presentation, correct?
No, I'm done.
You're done?
I'm done.
Okay.
But I'll take questions.
Questions of District Attorney Yook at this time by the board? Supervisor Garamendi?
Thank you very much, Barbara. I wish we had enough money to fund all the things, and I'm sorry about your physical location. That's miserable after that many years. Real quick, though, I know we're talking about budget, but you mentioned the study session. Can you go back to the page on the for the timber harvest? don't want to distract us, but I just want to make sure I got all that correctly.
Was this the slide you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay.
You mentioned that there's 28, I think you said there were 28 CAL FIRE timber harvest cases?
Referred to the circuit prosecutor.
Okay, and 25 of them had been filed were people who had filed applications
Right. I wasn't
as
able.
for the urgency ordinance.
Yes. Yes.
How many had been filed, how many investigations on illegal grows?
How many? Well, I
So
can only speak.
the
I can only
Delta
s-
3?
I can only speak to the ones that referred to the circuit prosecutor. Would be the 3.
Because there's an impression that we're prosecuting those who filed paperwork and invited law enforcement on, while we all know there are literally hundreds of sites of illegal clearing going on. So I just want to make sure that CAL FIRE is searching those people out as well.
And that question would be for CAL FIRE. I'm sure they're coming across what they're coming across. These are what were referred. I can't say how many investigations they had that weren't referred. I know that they are doing, they are at least considering some of the cases administratively, because they do have administrative options as well. There's administratively, there's civilly, there's criminally, and those are all 3 different options. And I don't know how these 28 were selected to be referred. Maybe that's all they were able to come across. Maybe that's all they could identify. Sometimes you go into a row, there's nobody there to cite, right? So, I can't say. That would be a question for CAL FIRE investigators.
Okay, I just want to make sure that, obviously, if we don't want to, we're trying to get people to comply with the law, and if they've broken the law like this, clearly that's a violation. But I want to make sure that we're going after the bad guys as well. There's been a lot of complaints in my district about it, clear cutting and people bulldozing without permits, and the poor sheriff has to listen to me complain about this all the time. But I want to make sure that we're prosecuting people who do break the law as well.
Well, and I would say that those need to be reported, and then you got to have someone respond. You got to have someone who's going to investigate, someone who's going to do the type of investigation that's going to stand up in court, or that's going to at least, it be put together well enough that we can identify the parties and we can contact them and we can see,
And it's
geez, are
probably-
we going to work it out? Are we not going to work it out? Is it going to go civilly? Is it going to go criminally?
And it's got to be a
So-
lot easier to do that when you have someone open the gate and welcome you onto their property to find that person. And
Well, once
obviously,
again,
they've
I
already
can't-
given DOJ
Well,
background checks
you
and
would
whatnot.
think. But again, you would have to ask CAL FIRE how they came about on these cases. Did they stumble upon them? Was this the process of investigating the legitimacy and whether or not the party had met everything that they said they were going to, and then they go to inspect, and it turns out they violated the law. So, and those are important things as well. So, this also shows you that, well, 25 people had filed saying, I'm doing the right thing and I got it all covered, and they weren't.
Right.
So, that's what the regulatory agencies are here for, to say, okay, are you in compliance? Or, did you write down Mickey Mouse and you live out of state?
I understand, and I
it's
agree,
it's
and
two parts
I
of it,
think
yeah.
that should be prosecuted. What I'm concerned about is that we don't have prosecutions against illegal growers up there as well, which I would think certainly there ought to be more than 3 if we've got 25. But I'll take it up with Adam and CAL FIRE.
I think, and my feedback I'm getting from the circuit prosecutor is that I'm doing a great job, that he's doing a fantastic job, and we have a very good working relationship with him. So I'm sure that you could just ask him, how did these come about, and
I will.
and
Thank
then
you.
kind of go from there.
I'm going to take this opportunity to call for a little break at this time. We'd like to, it's been brought to my attention that a request has been made to possibly continue this till tomorrow, and that's going to require a motion and a vote by the board. Ms. Shook, I would like to know if you're available tomorrow morning to continue?
I'm done. If there's no
Yes.
more questions, I'm done.
And at that time, we'll have the opportunity for other board members to ask questions in the morning at 9 o'clock.
Okay,
But
9
it is
o'clock.
going to require a motion. Do I hear a motion? Moved by Supervisor Mills, second by Supervisor Clapp. Any public comment? Hearing none and seeing none, I would bring it back to the board for a vote. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed indicate by saying no. Hearing none, motion carries 5-0, unanimous. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.